All right. It's 4:04. We have 7 XCAP members. I think we can start and people will join us as they can. So welcome to the XCAP meeting. We are going to do the roll call and then we'll have oral communications. And then we had a lot of public speakers at the last meeting. So if you are an attendee and you know you'd like to speak under oral communications, it would be great if you can raise your hand virtually. So we can calculate exactly how much time we can give to everyone, because I don't want to run long because of oral communications. You can always send us an email at xcap@cityofpaloalto.org. And okay, I'll let you, Sarah, call the roll for us.
Okie doke. Gregory Braille.
The button here.
Phil Burton.
Here.
Tony Carrasco.
Here.
In-Young Cho. Not here yet. Okay. Larry Klein.
Here.
Patricia Lau.
Not here.
Adina Levin. Here yet. Nadia Nayak.
Here.
Keith Reckdahl. Not here yet. Dave Shen.
Here.
Carrie Templeton.
Here.
Okay, you have a quorum.
Great, thank you. So again, we're on item number 2, oral communications. This is for members of the public to speak on an item that is not on the agenda. I'm going to it looks like we've got 4 speakers. We can have 2 minutes each. I will ask attendees if they plan on speaking, if we could have your hand raised by, let's say it's 4:06 p.m. Let's say if by 4:11 p.m. Your hand is not raised, then we'll cut off public comment, because although we've got more attendees going, we're trying to make sure that we don't have lots of people adding on at the last second, which made our public comment run long. So again, if you can, if you would like to speak during oral communications, if you could please put your hand up, now would be the time. And the person helping me time by 4:11 will cut off anyone who raises their hand after that time. So please raise your hand now. So go ahead, we can start.
Okay, thank you, Chair Naik. So far, it seems like we have 5 residents or participants interested in speaking. Our first speaker is Eduardo Lack. Please feel free to unmute yourself and begin to talk now.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And again, thank you for the great work that you've done. And I wanted to just sort of scan what you've posted this time and the fact that you're going to be presenting to City Council by the 31st. Please let us know when you're going to begin to start making decisions in terms of your recommendations so that we can be on top of that. I live in Churchill, 36 Churchill. My house is the one, Terry, and my wife's Terry. My house is the one that has the red library, and we want to thank everybody, all our neighbors, for continually putting books in there. I am for what you and your analysis has shown to be the best alternative, which is to mitigate traffic on Oregon and Embarcadero and to close Churchill for the safety of the kids. I had 4 kids go to Palo. They had to negotiate traffic. As I've said before, I saw a car being hit by a train. I've had a teammate whose son was killed by a train. We've had numerous pets killed by cars on Churchill. Our neighbor got hit. Safety is an issue. It is not quite in the consideration set, but I think it should be in the consideration set. But the analysis that you have all done says that the most cost-effective way, as seen in page 18 and also in pages 53.
Oh, Eduardo, I think you muted yourself.
Oh, let's see.
Apologize. The most cost-effective way for all of us to improve the situation is to do what you've suggested, which is mitigate Oregon, mitigate Embarcadero, and close Churchill. So I encourage you to make that decision. Thank you, or at least a recommendation. Thank you very much and great work.
Thank you. Our next speaker is O Hadidi. Please feel free to unmute yourself and you can talk now.
Dear XCAP members, my name is Omar Hadidi and I live in the Southgate area. First, I'd like to say thank you all for your dedication and hard work. I'd like to begin by taking a step back and urging XCAP to recommend that the City Council engages in discussions with the concerned entities on whether proceeding with grade separation still makes sense in this post-pandemic world. However, if it is to proceed, my family and I strongly support the Churchill closure proposal with the bike and pedestrian underpass and mitigations at Embarcadero and Oregon Expressway. We also strongly oppose the two other proposed alternatives, namely the partial underpass and the viaduct. We support Churchill closure for the following reasons. Number one, it serves as the first part of a phased approach to grade separation at Churchill. If necessary, either of the other two options can be implemented in a later phase. Number two, it is much less costly, totaling between $50 to $65 million. Number three, it is traffic friendly and traffic flow will be better than the current state of things as confirmed by the hexagon analysis May 5th. Number four, it is much safer, incorporating a bike and pedestrian underpass and reducing traffic backups on Churchill. We oppose the partial underpass for the following reasons. Number one, it depends on acquiring Caltrain's right-of-way, which is unlikely. It would also require eminent domain seizures. Number two, it bears a huge cost of between $200 to $250 million. Number three, it would significantly change the character of the neighborhood. We oppose the viaduct for the following reasons. Number one, it will cost between $300 and $400 million. Number two, it is less traffic friendly. It will be a worse level of service than the Churchill closure solution, see the hexagon analysis. And number three, it will also be a permanent eyesore to the neighborhood. Regrettably, some opponents of the Churchill closure have resorted to underhanded devices of illegally placing placards advocating for the position on public and private properties, including our own front yard. Some have even encouraged property seizures without any empathy for their affected neighbors, and all of that just to maintain access to Alma and shave off a few minutes from their commutes. Careful scrutiny of their statements reveals no other credible reasons for their position. So we urge you to recommend Churchill closure as the best alternative for grade separation at the Churchill-Alma intersection in the event that grade separation projects in the Bay Area are to proceed. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Terry Lack. Feel free to, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, if anybody else wants to speak during oral communications, now would be the time to raise your hand. Otherwise, we're cutting off oral communications so we can make sure that we have enough time. So great, go ahead, Terry. Terry, it's your turn to speak. Oh, you muted yourself. Try one more time.
Mute.
Yeah,
There, did I do it this time?
Yes, you did. Go ahead, Terry.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. Oh, technology, it loves me. That last speaker was amazing. And the points, I agree with virtually everything he said. There wasn't one thing he didn't say. I mean, the partial underpass makes no sense at all for the cost and the mitigation from Caltrans. The viaduct is going to be an eyesore and massively expensive. I mean, clearly we live in a neighborhood street, so I'll take it from a personal tone here. I live and walk Churchill every day with my dog, and it's a small street, and it should stay that way. We got kids, we got pets. Our neighbors have 2 little children, you know, and we need to keep Churchill safe. And if you make Churchill a big thoroughfare, it's not going to be safe. And it's not going to be something we want to see in 10 years when kids are getting hit and pets are getting hit and cars are getting hit. And I agree firmly that the people who have illegally placed signs, they did it on our yard as well. You know, I'm sorry, it's not going to be a couple more minutes for you to drive, but there is so many better reasons to spend hundreds of millions of dollars. And closing Churchill is easy, it's efficient, it's safe, it's going to keep our neighborhood a neighborhood. And that's where we live. And we want it to be a friendly neighborhood. And we don't want it to be some partial freeway or partial massive street of people zooming across Churchill. When our cats were hit, no one even stopped. I was screaming in the street. They didn't stop. Why? Because they were just driving down Churchill as the speed of light to get to the other side. So thank you for all your hard work. I know this isn't easy, and I know there are good, sides, and people have good thoughts, but closing Churchill is the only reasonable option with mitigations on Oregon and Embarcadero.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Lisa Nissen. Feel free to unmute and you can talk now.
Hi, my name is Lisa Nissim, and I live on Escobita in Southgate, and I must take issue with my fellow neighbors who just spoke and want to speak on behalf of doing anything but closing Churchill. Previous speakers portrayed Churchill as a highway, with cars driving fast down there. I've lived here for over 20 years and never seen Churchill as a highway. During peak hours, cars are inching through Churchill. Non-peak hours, they're driving generally at at the posted speed. I'm sure there are exceptions, but it's anything but a fast thoroughfare. I would encourage you not to kick this down the road and choose an alternative that does not close Churchill. If you were to close Churchill, it would drastically change the nature of our neighborhood and turn us into an island within Palo Alto, and also make it very difficult for emergency vehicles to reach us. Last week, there was a car burglary a couple of houses away from me, and the police were there within 2 minutes and they were able to catch one of the perpetrators. If Churchill and Alma were closed, that would not have happened. I'm very concerned about whether or not emergency vehicles would reach us. I also think that, I know that accessing my home would mean driving in circles around Palo Alto if we have no access across Alma. So in conclusion, I want to encourage you to choose any alternative other than closing Churchill. Thank you for your hard work.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Penny Elson. Feel free to unmute yourself and you can begin to talk now.
Thank you. At the last meeting, I made the comment that I thought the bicycle pedestrian connections for the partial tunnel, I'm going to be talking mostly today about Charleston and Meadow, are very unclear in the drawings. I'm very used to reading plans, and I'm having a lot of trouble figuring out how certain components on both Charleston and Meadow work for bikes and pedestrians. So I think just in summary, I sent you a long note earlier today, just a little while ago, but I think these latest plans are not ready for prime time at all. They're not ready for community meetings because the bike ped components, these are school routes, and people are going to be very concerned when they don't see clearly laid out bicycle pedestrian routes here. It's not clear to me from what I saw in the drawings whether or not the designers understand what the school commute crossings are, and I want to make sure they got walk and roll maps. So the note that I sent today has walk and roll maps for all the affected school sites. It also provides some information about school bike counts. In addition to that, I listed all of the relevant City of Palo Alto Comprehensive Plan goals, policies, and programs, because I noticed in the last meeting there were some references made by the consultants that it seemed to me they didn't know what these were. So I just want to make sure that we are looking at and keeping in mind the policies and that should be guiding this process relative to pedestrian and bicycle safety on these very, very well-used school commute routes. Thank you.
Thank you. Our final speaker is Susan Newman. Feel free to unmute yourself and you can talk now.
Hi there. I just want to second Lisa's comments about Churchill closure and finding any option other than that for the residents of Southgate, as well as I think for the broader community in Palo Alto. I wanted to encourage XCAP to recommend to City Council that the Embarcadero modifications should be separated from Churchill closure and be done in any case. I think we all agree that some work needs to be done at Embarcadero to make it a more usable thoroughfare. However, it's my understanding, tell me if I'm wrong, but that contrary to what some have said, those mitigations, according to Hexagon's own analysis, do not address very poor level of service at Oregon Expressway, which is where many of us would be in Southgate and elsewhere on the west side of Palo Alto, would be forced to go if we can't use Churchill to get to sort of make our route through town. So, and I want to also, I just want to take issue with the representation of those of us who are concerned about Churchill closure, that all that's driving it is shaving a few minutes off of our travels. I think that's kind of insulting. Obviously, if that's all it was, we wouldn't be strongly opposing Churchill closure. It's much more than that, and it's not just for Southgate residents, although it is importantly for Southgate residents that we oppose closing Churchill. Thanks.
Thank you. And Jason Stinson, you'll be our last speaker.
Great. Hey, I just wanted to also speak on the Churchill topic. I am in favor of closing Churchill, but I didn't want to take my time talking about that. I think last 2 XCAPs ago, I mentioned this as well to the XCAP members. I know it's a very complicated issue. It's a very challenging issue. I would highly encourage XCAP to use the data that's available to you, use the cost models, use the Hexagon reports, the traffic reports. At the end of the day, we have to fit within our budget for the city. We have to respect Caltrain's statements on right-of-way and whether we're going to be able to take those sections of it or not. We have to meet our traffic needs for the city. I've been really disappointed at the anecdotes and the sound bites and things like signs that try to simplify the message and look to be divisive and try to get people riled up with really simple messages. This is a complicated issue. You guys have a big job ahead of you. I really respect the time and effort that you're putting into it. I think at the end of the day, use the information that's available to you, to make those decisions. I think some of the things that we can't agree on in Southgate are, the Embarcadero interchange absolutely has to be fixed. That needs improvements, and we have a good cost model for that. I agree with the page mill as well. That's also, I believe, included in that model. Those things need to be fixed. Whether we close Churchill or not, I think you guys will need to take a look at it. But again, it needs to fit in the budget. It needs to respect Caltrain's right-of-way and their requirements, and it needs to meet our traffic needs for the city. So thank you, guys.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay, that concludes our public comment. Because I'm sensitive to concerns about safety, and we don't normally address speakers in public comment. I just wanted to make the point that there is actually a memo that was given to us from the Palo Alto Police and Fire Department about their response to the impacts of a closure on Churchill. That's available if you go to the Connecting Palo Alto website under the October 30th, 2019 meeting. The document is called Public Safety Memo, and there's 2 of them, one for Palo Alto Police and one for Palo Alto Fire. And I would say at a high level, their response was it doesn't impact their operations. So I just wanted to make that point because I know, especially in today's day and age, people are very concerned about safety, and I want to be sure that everyone can read the facts there. So, but thank you to everyone for giving us your thoughts. We're now going to move on to item number 3, which is action and discussion, which is the noise and vibration memo from AECOM. And I'm not sure who's going to be giving that a presentation. I think it might be Paul Birch. So Paul,
Yes.
I think you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, my name is Paul Berger. I'm a noise control board certified noise control engineer, working a little bit more than 30 years, mostly in transportation noise, and I'm very honored that you asked me to bring some information before you today. So I'm going to try to bring up my presentation here. Let's see if this works. I don't think that's it. Okay, are you seeing my presentation on the screen?
Yes, we are, Paul. It might be good if you put it in screen mode, although now we're seeing your notes screen and not your
Okay,
full
that's what I'm
screen.
trying to avoid. Let's try that again. How about that?
It takes a, there you got it.
Okay, very good. All right, so again, thanks for inviting me to come to talk to you about this. This has to do with this is kind of an overview of the noise and vibration comparative analysis we did for this project, for the kind of the grade separation project. And let me just, okay.
Paul, I did want to note, we don't have a copy of this presentation. So when you're done, if you could send it to someone at City of Palo Alto so they can post it for us, that would be great.
Okay, yeah, now you do have a copy of the report, and there's very little in this presentation which isn't in the report, so we can cross-reference it. And in fact, I have report page numbers for most of the displays in the presentation as well.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, so by way of introduction, here's some topics we're going to cover. We'll talk about why we did a noise analysis for this project. We'll talk about the methodology we did in executing that noise analysis. We'll talk about the noise survey we did in the community. We'll look over the studied alternatives, and then we'll go over our prediction of the operational noise and a more qualitative assessment of the operational vibration and construction noise and vibration, and a summary, trying to kind of bring some of that information together, and then also an update that we've received recently about some of the future trains that will be used for the project. All right, so in way of the purpose for the noise study, this whole Connecting Palo Alto project is really looking at a variety of potential options for eliminating some or most of the 4 grade crossings in the city of Palo Alto at the moment. So this study tries to evaluate the noise and to a lesser degree of vibration impacts of the potential alternatives, keeping in mind and listening to some of the speakers that preceded me, none of them actually mentioned noise. A lot of people are concerned about safety and pedestrian and bike access and cost and visual impacts and other things. So the results of this noise analysis are really to be taken in conjunction with all those other alternatives. But the results and recommendations we have here are strictly regarding noise. And so you see in the figure here, I just wanted to point out that within the city of Palo Alto, there are a total of 4 grade crossings, 3 of which are being proposed for various alternatives for separations. And there are also 2 station stops in Palo Alto and 2 more that are immediately outside of Palo Alto that impact this analysis. So the methodology for this project, first, we will be we'll talk about we conducted a site survey and noise measurements in the neighborhood to help us better understand the existing conditions in the project area. We will attempt to predict operational noise levels for the various alternatives, and this will be done via the established approach for the Federal Transit Administration Noise and Vibration Impact Assessment Manual under their detailed noise analysis procedures. We'll conduct a qualitative analysis for potential operational vibration issues. We'll conduct a qualitative assessment for construction noise and vibration, and then we'll try to kind of add some of those together to see if we can come up with some recommendations for which of these might be better alternatives in some areas than others. In the report, we do spend a good bit of time going over some noise, background on noise, just explaining the science of acoustics, and it discusses a number of different issues which you may find interesting. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail now, except I wanted to present this kind of overall, what we sometimes refer to as a sound thermometer that describes, you know, what different people, the different decibel levels that people experience in their everyday lives. And there's some common examples of both outdoor and indoor activities on this scale. I won't go over that in detail, except one thing is probably worth noting, that it usually provides some relative information to most people, is that you think about normal speech, when you have a conversational speech with somebody within about a hand's and arm's length away. So a conversation you might have at your dinner table at home or in a restaurant, that conversational tone with a low noise background is usually about 65 decibels. And if it's higher than that, you usually have to kind of strain to speak louder or strain to be heard. And if it's less than that, it's usually not much of an interruption. So that's maybe a good rule of thumb to, if you think that you're above or below your speech level, you're usually above or below about 65 decibels. I want to talk a little bit about the noise sources that we're considering in this study. And you can break those down to two main categories: trained noise sources and non-trained noise sources. And for trained noise sources, the biggest one that you're experiencing now in this neighborhood is the train horns. They're very loud. They're, as you probably know, they're required by federal law for trains to operate their noise as they approach a grade crossing. And in areas where you have a grade crossing, that's usually, you know, the 800-pound gorilla as far as what's generating the noise. Also, for most trains, you'll have a locomotive that either pushes or pulls the car, and it has the propulsion unit in it, and that usually creates noise, but only for the unit that actually has the propulsion unit, such as the locomotive. And in addition, you'll have rear wheel rail noise, and that is generated at the interface where the steel wheel is running along the steel rail, and that generates noise for all the cars, not just the ones that have the propulsion in them. In addition, it's important to realize that train noise, even though it may be the dominant noise during train events near the grade crossings, is certainly not the only noise. Road noise is another major factor in these areas. And you do have an arterial roadway, Alma Street, that runs the entire length of that, the rail line. And important to understand that even though it is not the dominant noise source when a train is not there, it is a dominant noise source for the 99% of the time when the train's not there. So it still makes an important contribution. When we were out there doing measurements, we did notice several times there's also aircraft noise, aircraft overflights in the area, and these are noticeable. And when they happen, you tend to look up and notice an airplane up there. Although I would say that it is not a major contributor to the overall average noise. They're pretty short duration events, and we compared the intervals when there was an aircraft and not aircraft, and there really wasn't that much difference. There are a few other community noise sources, such as activities at schools and parks, landscaping, you know, people mowing their lawns, that sort of thing. Occasionally have a neighbor with a loud air conditioner unit or likes to throw parties, but those are usually short-term activities and isolated. So they did not, even though that's a recognized community noise source, it really was not taken into consideration in this study. So we'll talk about the existing condition, what the noise environment is out there now. We did do a noise survey that was done in early March, and I would note that this was pre-COVID-19 shutdown. I mean, there was just some discussion at that time, say, are they going to shut things down? But for most part, I think the travel and the train schedules were still regular. They were still operating in their I realize now they have reduced the train service, but at that time they were still operating at the full train service. We conducted a survey at including several short-term measurements, which were like 15 to 60 minutes each at a variety of locations, and a few long-term full 24-hour measurements throughout the study area. Short-term measurements were at 14 locations, mostly representing homes, schools, parks, and typically within a few hundred feet of the rail line. And the long-term locations were conducted mostly near different areas near the actual grade crossings. We have a couple of maps here that indicate where these were in terms of the, so I have a kind of a red train symbol that indicates the actual grade crossing location. The yellow pins are the long-term locations, and the green pins are short-term locations. So here, this is along the northern end near Palo Alto have grade crossing. LT1, our long-term location 1 is near Park, as is ST1. ST 1-2 is near a kind of a park-like area, but simulates a first row receptor, and ST1-3 is also at a park, but at a similar setback to what a residential house would be in that area. Down north towards the Churchill Ave grade crossing, we had a long-term measurement there near the grade crossing, although I would say the setback from the actual rail is similar to what first row homes on the west side would be like. And then we had a series of other measurements representing second row homes, a park down there on the south side, a backyard there near the grade crossing, one at Palo Alto High School, and another one a little bit further up, again, not on private property, but at a distance that might be representative of a first row home on that side of the street. Then finally, down the area, kind of the combined area of the Meadow and Charleston grade crossings, we actually did a long-term measurement. It's a little harder to see. LT4 is up there near the intersection, up here near the intersection of Alma and Meadow, which is representative of the setback for a first row backyard. Another similar one over near Charleston. We did a long-term actually to represent a second row area back here near this, I think this Robles Park. Another first row simulated area here and a couple more second row. So we're trying to get a kind of a good variety of the land uses within a few hundred feet of the rail line where we would expect to see the highest noise levels. This is a sample of one of the long-term locations. You can see this is the 24-hour span that goes from midnight to midnight. So you can, the gray line here is actually the L max, so that's the loudest, the peak period during that typically a 5-minute interval, and the yellow is the average for that interval. So you can clearly see all these different spikes. These are very definitely driven by train activity. You can see just a few at night. These are probably a couple of these freight trains that are here like after midnight, and very heavy in the morning rush hour period here, and then the afternoon rush hour period here. And in part of our analysis, we actually went through and identified which of these events were train events. And we kind of surgically removed those and replaced them with a value that was more similar of a non-train event. And then we're able to sum those up to get an estimate of what the difference would be for the existing condition with trains and a condition if all the trains were to disappear. And found out that for these first row positions, it was pretty significant, up to 15 to 17 decibel difference between the environment with the existing trains and if all those trains were to disappear. Of course, that's not an alternative, unfortunately, but it tells you at least the contribution that the neighborhood is getting from the train activity. And here's a summary of all 4 of the locations. That one was just a snapshot from one. And you can see here that for LT1 and LT2 were both first row on the west side, which is closest to the train activity. And the delta there, the difference between those areas with trains or without trains over a, say, a 24-hour period would be about 15 to 17 decibels, which is pretty significant. LT4 was first row on the other side of Alma. That was more modest. And part of that is because they're being subjected to a higher base level of noise without the trains to begin with, because Alma is a pretty busy arterial street just on the other side of their backyard fence. And the long-term measurement for the second row park was actually very little difference between with and without trains, although it was a little more difficult there to actually estimate the train events because you obviously couldn't see the train events from there. So there was a little bit more guesswork involved. But that just shows kind of a snapshot of what the potential difference in the community is in the noise level with trains and without trains, and how much contribution the trains are making. All right, so we'll take a look at what we predicted for noise levels for these different alternatives. Although I'm sure, as most of you know, not every alternative is being considered for every area. So of the alternatives, and we'll get a much closer look at each of these in a moment, but one is for switching from a diesel to an electric powered train. And of course, if that was done, not really part of this analysis, but that would affect noise levels at all 3 of these grade crossings. The closure is only being considered for Churchill, as I understand it. The trench option is just for Meadow and Charleston. A viaduct option is being looked at all 3 locations. A hybrid location for just Meadow and Charleston. Tunnel, similarly, just for Meadow and Charleston. And an underpass option is being looked at for all 3 of these. So what we have next is a series of diagrams. I wouldn't even call these drawings. It's certainly not an engineering drawing. These are not to scale. They don't address a lot of the issues that people find important, like pedestrian access or traffic or visual. These are constructed mostly to help discuss the relative acoustical benefits of some of these different alternatives. The dimensions we have here are very typical. We're trying to kind of measure the typical range of distances between, say, the closer rail center line and the facade of the first and second row homes. You can tell by looking, so this represents the existing condition with grade crossings. You can see that the trains run much closer to the homes on the west than they do the homes on the east. And that's because you have a roadway in between the trains and the homes on the east, and that takes up space. So you can see the homes on the east are a little bit further away, and they're subjected to an intermediate noise source. And these are both locomotives, and you can see from the cross bucks we have here, so you'd imagine this would be a grade crossing, and there would be cross traffic here that would stop whenever the trains would come through, gates come down, trains would sound their horns, and that's the existing addition. The closure condition would actually be very similar to this, except there would be no more grade crossing. I know that there is a underground pedestrian tunnel for that option and a few other design alternatives, but from a noise aspect, it's like the existing grade crossing, except that crossing would be closed and horns would no longer be sounded. But horns are the major noise source, so even that is going to, as we'll see, gives a very big noise reduction benefit. All right, next we're looking at the viaduct option as it would exist, as it's drawn up for the Churchill grade crossing. Here, the track center lines are pretty close to what they are now, except now they're elevated up to 20 feet high above grade. First and second row homes on both sides, the same location, and the roadway on Alma Street remains largely where it is. Maybe some variation, but for the most part, it's the same place. A little bit different for the Meadow Charleston. If you toggle back and forth, you see basically it's similar, but it moves a little bit further to the east. So you can see it's almost splits the difference between the homes on the west and the homes in the east, but the roadway still remains at essentially the same location. For the hybrid location, we're kind of back to the original center lines as they exist today, but they would be raised up onto an embankment. And the embankment would also include these parapet noise walls about 6 feet high, which would do a very good job of helping to block the noise from the wheel rail interface. So that would be a good benefit. I should also mention that a lot of the cross-section diagrams you've seen so far include the intermediate construction, the shoe fly tracks that show where the tracks would be during construction. All these diagrams here are really focused on the final built alternative. I would also note here that one of the benefits for the hybrid, and as I failed to mention, both the viaduct and the hybrid feature these 6-foot parapet walls, which would help reduce the wheel rail noise, and that would be pretty efficient and effective. One of the special benefits to the hybrid is that it also would act as a natural sound barrier for the roadway noise for the homes on the west. It would have no effect for the homes on the east, but the homes to the west would get a bonus benefit, and that not only would part of the train noise be reduced by, number one, the elimination of horns, and two, this parapet barrier for the wheel rail noise, but it also reduced the highway noise. Trench option also runs on essentially the same existing right-of-way, rail center line as the existing location. Of course, the grade crossing would be separated, so there'd be no horn soundings. This does have an additional acoustical benefit that the edges of the tunnel here would act as a barrier. It would interrupt the direct line of sight between both the lower elevation wheel rail noise and the higher elevation engine noise. So they would receive that benefit. You'd have to be careful in the final design to make sure that these interior walls were acoustically lined with like a spray-on acoustement to keep the noise from reverberating off these walls and driving further back into the neighborhoods. But that's pretty standard practice anymore, and that can usually be incorporated. There's the south tunnel option. There's two variants to this. The passenger and freight in the tunnel option includes, we just have a sample. It's not one, one wouldn't be passenger, the other one freight, but it would carry mostly the passenger rail during the daytime and evening hours and freight on the overnight hours. So this is very efficient in reducing the noise. Essentially no noise gets through this barrier here of the, this is 45 feet deep, so you probably have a good 10 feet of soil between there. There's no noise coming out from under there. But you would see that Alma Street basically remains as is, that there would be no change there. The other option is with the passenger traffic running in the tunnels, and the freight remains at grade above ground, and it would still, the noise from the freight trains would be unabated, and they would still sound at grade. Those grade crossings would all still exist, but they would only be used and only have the horn soundings at night. And you'd think that this would be a worse alternative, but actually, as it works out, while there is a penalty to having those freight trains run above ground during the nighttime hours, there's really just a few of them. I think we were told there's typically about 3 per night, and they only take about a minute. But the benefit to this acoustically is that Alma Street would be cut down to 2 lanes, and that would reduce all day and all night the amount of traffic coming from Alma. So effectively, this is an acoustically better solution than all the traffic in the tunnels at night, because you have the benefit of reducing the traffic and the associated noise on Alma Street. Okay, we have 2 variants for underpasses. We have what I think they've been referring to as a full underpass for Meadow and Charleston, which means that the traffic on Meadow and Charleston will go completely under the trains and come up on the other side. And in this one, Alma would stay essentially as it is now. The chief acoustical benefit is that, of course, you're eliminating the horn soundings at the grade crossings, and there would be no more grade crossings in this area. But there's not too much else that is mitigating the noise from the trains here or from the roadway. The other option, which is just being proposed for Churchill, is this underpass. I think they're calling a partial underpass, to where the southbound lanes and one northbound lane from Alma would be brought down to the lower level and create kind of a lower level intersection. And this has the added acoustical benefit, is that part of that traffic noise from Alma would now be have the noise reduced, because it's no longer a direct line of sight from the traffic to the homes on either side. So that has a associated acoustical benefit with it. All right, so those are, I think, all the alternatives that we've been asked to take a look at. And going with the predicted operational noise, as I mentioned, we're using a technique that is laid out by the Federal Transit Administration Noise and Vibration Impact Assessment Manual, using their detailed noise analysis. And there's 2 different metrics that we're using here. One is for the peak hour, and that would represent the loudest for the busiest hour of the day, which, according to the current schedule, is about 10 train events per hour. But also that would take along with it kind of the peak hour for the traffic condition, surface traffic condition as well. The other metric we use was the 24-hour day-night noise level. This is an average over 24 hours with a 10 decibel penalty added for the nighttime hours to recognize that people are more sensitive to noise during the nighttime hours. And both of these are very common metrics. The peak hour LEQ is usually one used by FHWA for highway noise, and LDN is actually the primary metric that are used by the FAA around airports, but they're both commonly used for transportation noise impact analysis. A slide here that kind of goes over some of our modeling assumptions. I've had some feedback here on some of these values might be a little bit different. For train speeds, we assumed 50 miles an hour. I realize that the maximum train speed for this is higher than that, but we use 50 miles an hour thinking that was more appropriate for these locations that are actually near stations, taking consideration the acceleration of the trains. It would probably take at least the new trains I'm hearing about, probably about a mile to get up to that 79 miles an hour, and then they'd have to need another mile to get back down to 0 to stop at the next station. So we thought that 50 seemed like a reasonable number, but we can change that if we don't think that's representative. Train consists, we assume that the passenger trains were a locomotive and 7 and 6 cars, or maybe seven multi-propulsion cars. Freight trains were assumed to be 2 locomotives and 50 cars. Daily trains, we assumed 80 day and 12 night for passenger trains. And in this construct, day is 7 in the morning till 10 at night. So there'd be a few before 7 and a few after 10 that would be counted as night in that LDN calculation. And for freight, we were told typically about 3 trains per night and none during the day. So for peak hour trains, we assume 10 passenger trains per hour, no freight trains during the peak hour. For daily roads, we assume that ALMNA would be about 36,000 daily total for all 4 lanes, and about 4% heavy trucks and buses, and that would be split by about 85 day and 15 night, all at the posted speed of 35 miles an hour. They may have done a more detailed traffic noise analysis. These are kind of standard assumption conditions that Caltrans uses in splitting up vehicles in day-night splits. For the peak road hours, we assume that the traffic would be about 900 vehicles per hour per lane, and that's consistent with what they refer to as a level of service C, which usually represents the peak noise condition. You can get more vehicles per lane per hour out there, but then they start to get congested and the speed slowed down and the noise level actually starts to drop off. So that would be kind of a worst case condition. For building rows, of course, there's in both sides, there's usually a first row of residences and a second row. We assume the second row with less than a 35% gap, we get about a 5 decibel reduction for that shielding from the first row. We assume that those parapet barriers for the viaduct and hybrid alternatives would provide about a 10 decibel reduction for the wheel rail noise. And then some assumptions for what the attenuation would be for the trench and the tunnel options. We also assume hard ground that is no additional acoustical absorption. That's strictly kind of worst case conservative assumption. And also, we didn't give any extra benefit to backyard fences. Most of the backyard fences in this area are like board or stockade fences, and they actually provide very little acoustical benefit. So those are some of the assumptions we used in coming up with our model or our calculations. So here's some of the results we had. We predicted at 4 locations, is kind of consistent with the with those diagrams we had. We evaluated both first and second row receptors on the east and the west side, and those numbers come out differently because of the relative location of the rail line and the surface street. And for each one of those, we predicted both of these metrics, the peak hour metric and the day-night noise level, and they actually turned out to be surprisingly similar. So we had predicted levels with the existing conditions with the diesel trains. Those are not far off from some of the values that we actually measured. And then we also assumed an electric locomotive, and those were a little bit less. They actually, without reducing the horn sounds by doing a grade separation, changing out the locomotive actually had very little effect because it was a much smaller contribution than the horn noise. So for Churchill, we had 3 different alternatives: the closure, the viaduct, and the underpass. And again, this is just considering noise only. It looks like the underpass for Churchill had a slightly better result than the other 2, not by a lot. You can see for the first row peak hour, it's 67 dB versus 68 and 69 for the other 2, so they're actually pretty close. For Meadow Charleston, we had a wider palette to choose from. In this one, the tunnel with at-grade freight turned out to be the best option, just in terms of the lowest noise level for all these locations, except for the one, the hybrid actually beat it out slightly, but really we're talking about just a fraction of a decibel. So, and even though it may sound non-intuitive that the tunnel option with the at-grade freight would be a better noise solution than with putting those freight trains in the tunnel. But again, the difference there is that putting those freight trains at grade eliminates about half the noise coming from the roadway. And once you get rid of all the train noise, that's the only noise that's left. So it actually makes a pretty big difference. All right, so we also looked at operational vibration. We didn't model this as closely, but we used some kind of general rule of thumb about how the vibration levels might change for some of these different alternatives. And I didn't go into detail here, but in the report, we say that doing a screening analysis, there would be no impacts in terms of potential damage to any of the structures from the operational vibration. But for some of the homes within 100 to 200 feet, of which there are several, they probably do feel those trains when they come by, especially at night. And in talking to some of the residents there when we were doing our measurements, some of them said, oh yeah, we can feel those trains coming by. So it's not necessarily the level that's going to cause any damage in your house, but it's enough you can feel it, and sometimes just feeling it is enough for it to be annoying. So for the looking at each of these individually, the grade crossing closure would really have no effect on vibration. The trains are still on the same path and going the same speed in the same conditions. The viaduct options for both Churchill and Meadow, Charleston, they actually have a pretty significant reduction in wayside vibration. And that's because the vibration is just being generated from these posts in a circular fashion, as opposed to from an entire rail line in a linear fashion. And that could reduce the vibration levels by as much as 10 dB. So that'd be pretty significant. The hybrid trench and tunnel options would maybe provide a slight reduction in the vibration levels, only because the location where the vibration is being generated, the wheel rail interface, is being moved a little bit further away, but maybe not a noticeable amount. And the tunnel underpasses, we assume, would probably have little or no change in vibration level. And we'll talk a little bit about construction noise and vibration. I do reference this to page 25 in the report, and there's actually a lot more information there about some of our assumptions, the type of equipment would be used, and the type of processes they would have to implement. And for the sake of being able to read this on a slide, I put all that stuff out. But if you refer to that table in the report, it goes into some detail. And we determined that the grade crossing closure would actually probably be the very minor construction noise vibration. It has a very short duration. They're not having to move the tracks, they're not building or taking out the temporary tracks. There'd be some noise associated with constructing the pedestrian tunnel underneath, but that would be relatively minor in comparison to the others. The viaduct also, you'd be constructing the posts and the pathway for the new travel lane, and you'd have to construct temporary tracks, but generally that's less noise than most of the other alternatives. Now the hybrid and tunnel options would be, I would say, moderate to severe, mostly because you still have quite a bit of heavy equipment out there, but the added problem is that you either have to bring in or take out a lot of material, a lot of fill, and that's going to create heavy dump truck haul routes, which generate noise not just at the construction area, but along the entire haul route until they get to a major highway, and that can be a significant noise impact. Also, these other ones have a longer duration. The hybrid tunnel trench are all 4 to 6 years of construction duration versus 2 years for the grade crossing or viaduct. And the underpass, we consider that severe as well, because that's going to require building bridges, and building bridges requires pile drivers, and pile drivers they're the 800-pound gorilla when it comes to construction noise and vibration. Anytime you have those out there, it causes a lot of heartache. There's some ways to avoid that, but you can never avoid it completely. Also, we don't really know the duration on that, and that would probably be the most disruptive in terms of a lot of construction around all those areas as they're building connecting roads and everything else. So they would probably have the most significant structure noise impact. All right, and finally, what we tried to do is try to sum all this information together and add up the potential benefits and costs in terms of noise vibration for all the alternatives in each of these locations. And these are relative. That is, we tried to rank each one, which one has the best noise benefit, which one has the least, which one does nothing to reduce vibration, which one does a significant amount, and which ones have very less noise, construction noise vibration impact versus those who have the most. And then we added them up. Now in this ranking, we made operational noise 0 to 5, giving it a little bit more weighting, because I think that's what most people are more concerned about, the operational noise. And then for vibration and construction, we rated each of those on a 0 to 3 scale. And so you add those up and you see that for Churchill, even though the underpass probably gives the best noise reduction benefit, the vibration benefit from the viaduct would be a major contributor, and you add in the construction noise impacts. And from our assessment standpoint, the viaduct would probably be the best option in this location, strictly from a noise vibration standpoint. Very important to reinforce. That's all we're looking at when we're coming up with this rating. For Meadow, we have a wider range of options to look at. And in this construct, the hybrid and the tunnel with the freight at grade were actually pretty close. The hybrid, the tunnel with freight at grade was probably the best at noise reduction. The hybrid, it had that extra benefit of serving as a noise barrier for some of the traffic on Alna for some of the receptors on the west side, and also did a little bit better job at reducing the vibration levels. And so those two actually turned out to be about even. You know, the hybrid or the tunnel with freight at grade would be about even when it came to, again, just the noise and vibration assessment. All right, so that pretty much summarizes what's in the report that you've all had a chance to look at. We did get some feedback from that report the day after it went out, and that was from Mr. Brandt, I believe. And he correctly pointed out something that, frankly, we were not aware of. And that's that Caltrain had made a selection, has already committed to a selection for the new trains that are going to be used in this area. And it's not just replacing the diesel locomotives with electric locomotives, but it's creating, purchasing and putting into service entire new train sets, 7-car train sets. And these are what they call EMU, or electric multi-unit vehicles. So the difference here is that there is no locomotive. Each car, even the front car, they call it a cab car because it has a control cab in the front, but even it carries passengers. And the power unit is distributed throughout the train. I don't think every single car has a power unit, but I think 4 or 5 out of the 7 have a power unit. That itself might not be the biggest difference, though, because it still takes a certain amount of energy to push or pull a 7-car train, up and down this rail corridor. So it's still going to produce noise. It may produce a little bit less noise than the diesel locomotive. And you don't see a lot of these diesel locomotives on the West Coast. You see a lot of them on the East Coast. They're in very wide use up and down the Northeast corridor. But to have a heavy rail EMU is kind of a newer concept in the U.S. Here's where it would make a big difference: is for both diesel and electric locomotives, the power unit is up near the top, or at least the venting for the power units is up near the top of the locomotive. It's a high elevation. It's 14 to 17 feet up in the air. And that gives it a certain acoustical advantage in terms of projecting into the neighborhood. This train, from what I'm told, the power units are down near where the wheels are, maybe just 1 or 1.5 feet above the top of rail, a much lower elevation. And for the evaluation of our alternatives, the big difference is that those 6-foot parapet barriers for the hybrid and viaduct alternatives would be much more effective at reducing not just the wheel rail noise, but also the power noise, the engine noise from the traction motors that are now at a much lower elevation. So what we did is we went back, and we just got this information on Friday, and we don't have any of the actual acoustical data for these trains yet, but doing some kind of back of the envelope calculations, we revisited our little table here. And what we did is we added an extra point for the alternatives, which would get that added benefit of now having the motor noise mitigated by those 6-foot parapet barriers. So we added an extra point just for the noise, operational noise, but with the viaduct option for both locations and the hybrid option for the Meadow Charleston location. And this didn't change things a lot. As you may remember, the viaduct option was already the quote unquote winner for Churchill. So it actually got a little bit more of a lead. And for the Meadow Charleston, that actually broke a tie between the hybrid and the tunnel with freight at grade, putting it slightly ahead of that option, and also bringing the viaduct option up to a second place tie, if you will. So this is not, I'm not sure how rigorous this is. This is just an effort to try to kind of sum together the benefits of the operational noise, operational vibration, and construction noise and vibration for a kind of an overall ranking, I guess. And I'm certainly willing to answer any questions I can. That's the end of our presentation. Everything that I just discussed is presented in the report that was sent out last Thursday, except for those last 2 slides, which respond to information we got since that report went out.
Great, thank you, Paul. So ex-cappers, I'm going to ask you to raise your hands if you'd like to ask a question, and I'll take you in the order that I see you. I see Adina Levin first, followed by Greg.
Let's see. Am I double unmuted here? Can you hear me? Great. Yep. So thank you very much for taking into consideration that these are, in fact, EMUs. One more change that is not in here, if you could comment on how much of a difference it would make, is that the electrification project is expected to have, in the short term when they go live, to increase from another one additional train per direction per hour. And it's going to go from 5 trains per direction per hour to 6 trains per direction per hour. And then in their medium-term planning, Caltrain is looking to increase to 8 trains per direction per hour. Then another change, which would be significantly later, is having the max speed be going from 79 to 110, which would be potentially in conjunction with high-speed rail, which is not a project that is moving very quickly. But so if you'd be able to comment on, and then let us know if that's something that you'll be doing some updates based on like how much of a difference is that increased frequency going to make, both in terms of the 2022 condition and the potential 2030 condition with the 8 trains per direction per hour.
Well, that's a good question. For this analysis, we stuck just with what the existing schedule was. We certainly could. I don't think we had planned to look at different future scenarios. We're told to kind of take the existing condition forward. You are correct in assuming more trains are going to result in more noise. However, I would say that from a practical standpoint, that's going to be kind of a rising tide rises all boats, right? So you'd expect that increased noise levels from additional trains would affect all of these alternatives in generally the same amount. As far as the train speeds go, I do know that the maximum service speed for the future EMU's Stadler-KISS vehicle is on the order of 79 or 80 miles an hour. But I also think that to defend our use of using 50 miles an hour, I think that provides, that recognizes kind of the practical limit that you're operating, that each of these grade crossings is within about a mile of a station. And at the design acceleration of 3.6 feet per second, it'll take those trains about a mile to get up to that speed. And unless they're planning on goosing it up to the maximum speed and then instantly slamming on the brakes, I'm not sure. I haven't seen the actual speed profiles for these, and I'm not sure if those exist yet. But and this is also based on some of our observations out there, that it seemed like the combination, sometimes a little more than 50, as it was kind of maximum speed moving away from a station, and in some cases slowing down. The EMUs, I should say, also do have a little bit of a difference in terms of their braking system. They use most of them use a regenerative braking, like a hybrid car would, and that may make a difference in some of it may actually create a little bit more noise as that rotational energy is put back through a generator to produce additional electricity. I think those would be fairly minor effects. If we wanted to, and we certainly did not look at the high-speed train. And so different things come into effects with high-speed trains when you're up over 125 miles an hour. Actually, when we're talking about engine noise and wheel rail noise and all that kind of noise, over 125 miles an hour, those generally go out the window, and you're talking about aerodynamic noise, just the whoosh sound of a train going by at 125 to 160 miles an hour. So the mechanics changed a little bit when you get a little further up there, but I don't think that we were tasked with including the high-speed train in our estimates. I mean, we could, but yeah, that wasn't part of our.
So in terms of the high-speed trains, they would be running slower on the Peninsula Corridor in this heavily populated area. So I don't think there is no expectation that there's ever going to be trains going 150 miles an hour up the Peninsula Corridor. But it could be, for example, 110. So thank you very much for the explanation that with the increased, more frequent service, that it would be proportional, and therefore the relative scores and the different options would be the same. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks. Next is Greg, followed by Dave Shen.
Thanks. I have a bunch of questions. You mentioned the 50 mile an hour speed as because we're within 1 mile of station, But at least in Caltrain's current configuration, there are trains I know that stop in Mountain View and then don't stop again until Palo Alto. So at least in the Charleston Meadow area, I don't know for sure. I can fire up my copy of Train Simulator on my PlayStation if you want, but I wouldn't be surprised if they maybe got to be above 50 as they came through the Meadow and Charleston area. Might be cool if someone went out there with a radar gun and just found out. So that's one thing to keep in mind. That
I did
might
spend some
support
time
changing
standing
50.
out there. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, and again, if you change 50, that would change the that would affect all the alternatives.
Affect everything.
And we're not really looking so much at the absolute noise level. We're looking at the difference between the two alternatives. So I'm not arguing. You could make a case for the fact that some of the trains are coming through. There are some express trains. Although I did note that in the current schedule, the pre-COVID-19 schedule, I think I counted only 3 trains that did not stop at least one of those 3 stations within the study area. So they're stopping someplace. A couple of them might be blasting through, but we are talking about kind of on average. And we could run it up to 50, or I think when I did a little playing around, the change in levels for some of these between 50 and 60 and 70 miles an hour is on the order of maybe 2 or 3 dB when you goose it up by an extra 10 miles an hour.
Okay. Yeah. And that's actually where I have most of my question. But one other minor thing is you mentioned in the beginning, the public comment, nobody mentioned noise. That's unusual. We've been at this process for what feels like at least 2 years. I think I didn't even have all my children when it started. No, not quite. But in the history of this, people mention noise a lot. And people, especially in the Charleston Meadow area, are very concerned about train noise. And the perception is that elevated options are much noisier, therefore we don't want them. Just that's something to deal with. So to that end, I'm trying to understand from your table of predicted noise levels, which in my report is table 5.3, but you seem to have a slightly updated version for us. It looks in many, sorry.
I think what I did is I just parsed it down a little bit. Yeah.
Okay.
Just to get it fit on the slide better.
Yeah. I'm trying to understand how you got from those noise levels to the 2 other charts that make a more subjective interpretation. And the reason why I ask is because earlier in the report, it says basically for a typical person in a typical environment, they can tell a 3 decibel difference, and a 5 decibel difference seems a lot noisier, and a 10 decibel difference seems like twice as noisy. In many of these charts, the differences between one alternative and the other, in fact, whole columns of numbers, are within 3 decibels of each other. So I'm having a hard time reconciling the chart that says one alternative is much better than another, or the chart that says, for instance, the viaduct options will have an increase in wheel noise over all the others, with the actual numbers, which for the vast majority of the options other than the existing ones, seem to be almost the same. So I don't know if there's any way you can help us map that to like a noticeable difference in noise level versus a theoretical difference in noise level.
Well, let me help you out with that, Greg. I appreciate those are all very good questions. We get those all the time. Let me say by saying first that I am a noise control engineer, and I'm always in favor of making less noise. So you don't have to convince me. You don't have to get me on your side. I'm not here to push any particular alternative over the others, but I understand when people complain about, my whole career is about people complaining about noise. And if they didn't, I'd have to find some other career, frankly. So I don't have a problem with people caring about noise. Yeah.
I'll stop interrupting, and then I'll interrupt one more time, and then I'll stop. I want to make sure that we don't leave the public with a perception that alternative X is way noisier than alternative Y, when in fact a normal person wouldn't even be able to tell the difference, or they'd have to work really hard. So that's why I'm kind of asking you to help me with that.
All right. Well, that's a very good point, and that frankly that question comes up. That issue comes up probably more than anything else, is what's a noticeable difference? And I see a lot of other noise consultants will put in a report, say, well, it's less than 3 dB increase, so no one's going to notice. I go, well, you can't get away from the fact that a 67 dB noise level is 3 dB higher than a 64 dB noise level, and it's louder. And if you say that's less than 3, and then we're going to do something else to make it less than 3 again and again, pretty much you're up to 10. So the general rule of thumb, and this is very subjective to different people. It has to do with your hearing acuity and your hearing health and your age and maybe your political affiliation. I'm not sure. But for the most part, generally, most people can just barely perceive a 3 dB difference in the real world. If you put them in one environment and the average level is 63 and you take them to another environment and it's 65, you're going to say, which one's louder? They might say, I don't know, they're probably about the same. When you get to 3 dB and above, that's where they start to notice a difference. Maybe just barely perceive, I think this one's a little bit louder. And 10 dB is where they say it's like twice as loud or half as loud if you're reducing it. And this comes up a lot of times where, like at highway noise projects, people are going to build a noise wall and you're going to say, well, it's going to reduce the noise level from 75 to 65 in your backyard. They say, well, that doesn't sound like a lot, but that's about twice, half as loud as it was. And that's a very noticeable change. But you're right. And say, if you're splitting the difference, saying this one is the only one that's worth building because it gives you a 1.5 dB benefit over the other one. You're right. That's not necessarily the sole thing you want to make your decision on. But it is a difference. And if you're looking, if all other things remaining equal, this one is 2 dB louder or less loud than this one, maybe that's a reason to make that differentiation. And that's also all we try to take in consideration, say, the vibration and the construction noise and vibration, because those are elements that need to be taken into consideration as well. And there's one other thing I wanted to, you see the idea of the viaduct and the hybrid being louder. Normally that is true. When you raise a noise source, it tends to travel further. And in the case of the analysis we had here, we even took into consideration that first row shielding effect on the second row homes might be lessened by the fact that some of these alternatives were higher up in the air. Maybe now you're standing in your front yard in your second row home, and now I can actually see, I couldn't see the train before, now I can see it, and I think it's louder. And that might be true. But the thing that works in favor of those two alternatives is that 6-foot parapet barrier, because that knocks down not only the wheel rail noise as we originally estimated in this report, but also with these new EMUs, it'll also help reduce the traction motor noise. And that doesn't leave a whole lot. Once you've gotten rid of the horns, once you've gotten rid of like a 10 decibel reduction on both the wheel rail noise and the traction motor noise, the effect of making that higher in the air will be lessened. You might still be able to see them, and some people may not be happy about that, but it's not going to be that much of a difference. The other thing that makes things elevated into the air propagate more efficiently is that they are not necessarily near the ground zone where you have maybe some absorptive material, like a lawn or some sort of a grassy field will absorb more noise if it's at a lower elevation. For these estimates, we assumed that it was basically hard ground. There was either kind of hard packed gravel or the pavement from Almond Street, and you weren't getting a lot of excess attenuation from the lower elevation because it wasn't, necessarily a nice grassy field in between, but 50 feet of hard asphalt. So I would say not to overthink the benefit of this analysis here. Sometimes the differences between the first and the second place are a fraction of a dB, and that's probably not going to be audible. But in the aggregate, as far as picking the best solution versus the worst solution, maybe that makes a difference. But I would say that, as other people mentioned before we got into the noise portion, maybe noise for a lot of these people is not the biggest concern. And for every single one of these alternatives, every one, from the best to the worst, they're all a massive improvement over what's existing, because once you get rid of that horn noise, you're getting rid of 90% of the noise.
Even in your worst alternative, you show at least like a 12 decibel improvement or something like that for the people nearest the tracks.
Yeah, and
maybe 10 in some cases.
Yeah, and you get rid of that horn, and I'm sure if you've been standing by one of those grade crossing when the train comes by, it is bone shaking when they sound that horn. And you may have also, people in this neighborhood may have also noticed that even though there's a prescribed horn sounding sequence that the operator is supposed to use, it's a long, long, short, long that starts at up to 1,500 feet away from the grade crossing. It's always different. There's some of these operators are very heavy handed, and some are very light on the horn, especially maybe if they're going through at night. But the thing they have in common is if they see anybody or a car near the tracks, they lay on that thing. And sometimes it can be much more than even what we predict for an individual event, because engineers don't like running people over. It ruins their day when they do that. So.
Yeah, no, we've had a number of members of the public mention that some trains are noisier than others from the horn perspective. I wanted to ask about vibration. You mentioned that the viaduct option would actually be 10 decibels less in vibration. And I don't know how to measure vibration in decibels, but what does that mean to an actual person standing near the tracks to have a 10 decibel reduction in vibration?
Well, that's a good question. Vibration was kind of a secondary issue, so we didn't spend as much time going through the science and technology of vibration. But we could have made this a 100-page report if we would have put our mind to it. Vibration is measured in a couple of different ways. The first one is in peak particle velocity, which actually is measured in velocity metrics of inches per second, and that's usually used for assessing building damage. And sometimes it's not. You usually have this when you're have a pile driver operating, within 15 feet of someone's house. You might start to get some architectural damage. But for annoyance, for what people feel, they usually use something called a vibration decibel, which is like a sound decibel is a logarithmic metric, but 10 dB difference is a pretty big difference. And I think that may be enough where the viaduct option, and the reason the viaduct reduces noise by vibration by so much is it instead of generating vibration along every inch of the at-grade tracks, it only generates the vibration that comes down through the pillars, and the vibration energy that comes down through the pillars then propagates in a spherical sense as opposed to in a cylindrical sense. So the vibration spreads out more quickly, and there's less of it coming down, and that was that 10 dB reduction is actually recommended by the FTA document. But I certainly believe it from having done a lot of these measurements in the field. So I would say the 10 dB difference in vibration is pretty significant. The other ones you might get might be more like 1 or 2 dB difference.
So would a person notice a 10 dB difference in vibration? Is that kind of what I'm trying to understand?
I think so. I think it's especially the first row west side homes, some of which are within almost as little as 50 feet from the tracks. And I did do a measurement in someone's backyard who was there. And I asked her, say, do you ever feel the trains as they go by? And she, without hesitation, said, oh yeah, absolutely. And sometimes you get used to it. Some people get habituated to noise vibration. Some people live with it for 10 years and then they finally decide they're going nuts. But for the vibration, it's usually just enough. If you can feel it, if you can distinctly feel it, it's usually, most people would consider it annoying because it's kind of unnerving. You're sleeping and suddenly your bed starts to shake, and that's enough to kind of rattle your nerves a little bit. But I think and maybe it would just be those first row homes on the west side that right now are maybe only 50 to 100 feet away from the tracks, that might be enough for that alternative to go from being able to feel it to not being able to feel it.
Okay, that's what I was kind of trying to understand. Thank you very much.
Oh, no problem. Thank you.
So we have Dave Shen, and then Dina, before I take you again, I'm going to let Tony go, and then I'll give folks a second round, but I just want to let people who haven't had a chance to ask questions first do that. And then, because I also want to be sensitive to the fact that we need to get public comment. So, so it'll be Dave, and then Tony, and then Keith, and then back to Adina.
Okay, first, thanks very much for this report. I think this might be the first time I've seen a pretty detailed noise study here. And then thanks to Greg, because he actually asked my question, which was, it seemed like to me that the dB difference on a lot of the data here wasn't all that significant. Now, the other data point which I wasn't sure about, which you had mentioned, which is maybe within 3 dB, I would not be able to tell whether one thing was actually better or louder than another. And whether that also how much louder are we talking about? Like, oh, maybe a teeny bit louder or annoyingly louder, right? It's like that seems to be a little bit tough to discern at 3 dB. But then you said at 10 dB, yeah, people can go, oh, well, it's 2x in one way and then half in the other. But then what concerns me then is, and I would advocate for maybe a change in the rating system here, because it would seem like to me that all these options that range from like 6 to 8 would then potentially mean that there really isn't a difference from a noise and vibration perspective, and that significant differences like the jump down to 3 in the Metal Charleston underpass may be something that should be really noted, but that when we're talking about a difference between 6 to 8, that it really doesn't matter all that much, maybe in one way a little bit, but not in others. I don't know. Thoughts on that?
So you're talking about, let me see, you can see my screen up here, is that right? So you're talking
Yeah.
about in this table here?
Yeah, for example, yeah.
Okay, well, again, this was, we're trying to put together kind of rankings for these three different issues: the noise, vibration, and the construction noise vibration. And again, I said we went 0 to 5 on the noise to give that a little bit more, a little more heavy weighting in this final number. And so really, I was looking on a scale from 0 to 5. You know, is 0 is basic, and not 0 is not necessarily the worst, but 0 would mean no noise benefit, and 5 would be the best noise benefit. And so for Churchill, for example, we're saying that both the closure and the viaduct are going to give you a moderate noise benefit, and the underpass is going to give you something more. And so I would, for example, I know somebody said, well, how do you get the underpass at Meadow Charleston as a 2 and the underpass at Churchill as a 5? I mean, aren't they pretty darn close? Well, they are. The underpass at Churchill works better because it also helps to mitigate some of the road noise, because half of Alna is now down at that kind of underground level, and the noise from that would be reduced. But in kind of developing these kind of relative scores for these, we were looking within each of these locations. So it wasn't intended to have a direct comparison between the underpass at Churchill and the underpass at Meadow Charleston, for example. You know, I was kind of looking at that too for the underpass versus the contributions from the other alternatives at those locations. And also I did want to include, and like I said, for these second row homes, they're probably not feeling any vibration now, so there's not going to be much of a vibration benefit for them. But for those people who live in the first row, especially on the west side, that could be a big factor. And so that's why I did provide a little bit more benefit for the viaduct. And here also the viaduct at Churchill. Remember that the viaduct location is actually much closer to the homes in Churchill, and it's further away from Meadow. That's why you get a slightly better rating there. So I didn't. This is a little less rigorous than the actual predictions that we did, but it's trying to find some way to put together the kind of combined effect of all these. And again, this is, maybe use this as a tiebreaker when it comes to when you evaluate cost and safety and some of the other issues, and say, we just can't make up our mind between, the underpass option and the hybrid option. Say, well, if you use noise as a tiebreaker, you want to consider the hybrid option, all of the things remaining equal. But I think that any opportunity, any effort to try to make this more precise would require us to make some assumptions, would start to get increasingly sketchy over, how much of a benefit you assign to a noise reduction as you would assign to a vibration reduction. So I think you're right. You wouldn't take this too seriously, but this was an effort to kind of provide a composite relative sense of which of these might be better options than others. But it's also understanding that, the big difference is getting rid of those horns. So it's almost like these are second place tiebreakers. These are all winners when it comes to reducing noise once you eliminate those horn sounding requirements.
So I get all that, and I appreciate the attempt. The result is we're going to have a bunch of people who didn't sit into this meeting, or even though we tell them that there is a meeting like this that they can listen to, they're just going to look at the numbers, and they're just going to point, 8, they won, right? And 3, that guy lost. And they're going to miss all the nuances of what we just talked about here. And so that's where the danger is when we present information like this and it sits out there for perpetuity. And then we have to then re-explain everything again, of which a lot of people may not hear. And so
it's going to go on a lawn sign,
It's going to go on a lawn sign. It's all going to get out there, and then we're all going to have to backtrack and educate again, and it's going to get missed. So what I would love for us to find is some way of saying that, there's a bunch of these 50s and 60s sitting in that other table, which you're trying to distill here, but you know what? You're not going to hear the difference between 57 and 60. You're just not. Or you're going to barely hear it, and it may not bug you, right? And it's not going to.
that's what XCAP will be able to do in their report. So I hear you, but I think, the data is what the data is. And he does have caveated in there that this is simply a noise analysis score and not an overall score. And so, yeah, XCAP's job is going to be tough as it is with all of the data that's conflicting, but I hear it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
And I did want to recognize the fact that just a noise benefit, a difference in the noise benefit, is not the whole story when you're considering the vibration as well. Because someone might take a look at this table here, operational noise, and say, "Oh, look, the underpass is a whole dB, 1.3 dB lower than the viaduct." And you're right, that's a difference, but it's probably not a noticeable difference. So, but if you add in the fact that the viaduct will generate a noticeable reduction in vibration, and also is going to have like a 1/3 of the duration for the construction noise and vibration, is that enough to put it a little higher in the ranking? And also, to be sure, the predicted noise level, this is actually the result of a modeled calculation. That's why we're showing 1/10 of dB, because we were actually able to crunch the numbers. That's what the numbers said. The operational vibration and the noise and vibration, and I do stress that I stripped down these tables to put them in the slide presentation. If you look at these corresponding tables in the report, they have a lot more information, like with the assumptions, like which of these are going to require pile drivers, which of these are going to require haul routes, things that really make a difference. But I would have had to break this up into 2 or 3 different pages, so I want to include all of our information. But I think it is important that you take these 3 things together, and that summary table does at least include an effort to consider all 3 of these modes in an overall. And I actually originally labeled these as rankings, and I wanted to change that to ratings, because maybe ranking suggests first, second, and third place, and a rating says this one's maybe a little bit better, this one's maybe, and I didn't want to say worse. I mean, there's good and better and best. These are all good alternatives from a noise and vibrations, from a noise standpoint. So I didn't want to suggest that any of these are a loser, but some of them are going to contribute more performance in noise reduction. But the big thing you want to consider is some of these things cost. I'm not a cost consulting engineer, but some of these are like 10 times what the cost of the tunnel. I think that's the most expensive, right? The cost of the tunnel has to be 10 times the amount of the closure, right? So that certainly has to be, at least as important as the noise part of it. But I was paid to do the noise part, so. I mean, the one thing we could do is we could leave out this kind of aggregate table here. We could just say, here's the calculated noise benefit, here's the qualitative vibration benefit, here's the qualitative noise and construction noise vibration impact, and then the end, leave it at that, and not allow someone to just take that last graphic and think that's all I need to know.
All right, I want to be sensitive to time and be able
Sure.
to make sure XCAP members can continue to ask questions. So
Sure.
It'll be Tony, Keith, Phil, and then Dean, I'll give you your second bite.
So Paul, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So Paul, there's a lot of really good data here. To sort of follow up on what Dave brought up is how do we message this data and without confusing or trying to favor one over the other, because it's eventually a merger of many different aspects that make our choice. But one thing that might serve to explain this to the public well is you mentioned that there was a 17 decibel difference between ambient noise and the existing train. And I'm wondering if you can show us what that difference between ambient noise and the alternatives that you're looking at, that you're evaluating. And that might be a clear difference maker in terms of how we choose, because the new product will always, I think, be better than the 17 decibel ambient noise, train noise. The second issue that I'd ask is if we can do decibel noise contours on a map that show those 3 numbers, which is the ambient noise, the existing 17 decibel increase in noise when trains come by. And the third one is what would that difference be with the options. And then if you can plot those on a contour map to show, a decibel contour map to show how it affects the corridor, I think it would explain things better, and it will might show that the new product, the new EMU, is quieter than the existing train.
Well, we could, I mean, one way to do this would be to produce noise contours. And the problem with noise contours is they show a very precise location for a noise contour. And the data that we have to use is usually not nearly as precise as the contour would suggest. For example, we talk about when we did this calculation from some of our long-term measurement locations and what the difference was in the 24-hour level between the existing environment with trains and if we magically caused all the trains to disappear. And that's not just the horn noise, that's everything, that's essentially no more trains. We replaced the train events with a level that was indicative of a no train event in that location. So that's really like the maximum difference you might see. That's trying to separate what's the contribution from the overall train noise at these particular locations. And the ones that showed that biggest difference, I mean, they were kind of right there at the grade crossing. So that was like the best possible example. Also for a contour, for noise contours to really be accurate, we'd have to, I think, model cross traffic. We'd have to model the location and height of every single structure along either side. And while that might give us some more significant or at least more detailed looking map, I'm afraid that might be more, the graphical results would be more precise than the data we actually have going into it. So I'd be a little bit concerned about that. It would also, take a good bit of doing. I don't think we planned on that in our original scope. We could generate those contours, but I think they would, I hope you understand what I'm saying. I think they would suggest more precision than actually exists in the prediction model.
Yeah, no, I understand, but it would be better than not knowing. Yeah. If you can put a wider band on the decibel level, it would help us understand and explain this data to a person in 30 seconds or we need to be able to explain our decisions eventually, right? So we need to sort of understand what the new decibel level will be compared with the old decibel. And if we can do a map, that would be great, even if it's with a fuzzy line, or if you can say there's a 10% error in this data in the line.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say it's an error, but more of an uncertainty. Like we talked about, about the variation. Right now, the dominant noise source is the horn noise, and some engineers come through and they do a little toot toot, and the next one comes on and he lays on that thing 100% from a quarter mile away to a quarter mile on the other side. Some of them blow it straight through the grade crossing and all the way in the other direction. And so just the variation in the individual events is pretty significant. And what we're going by is the prediction procedure that is recommended by the federal government. I think that we did compare that to some of our measurements and found that they were a reasonable estimate. But there's a lot of variation in the actual measured data. And so like I said, the concern about that would be it would suggest a very precise answer to what is based on some less precise assumptions in terms of what some of the controlling parameters are in the prediction.
Tony, are we ready to move on?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So Keith, followed by Phil.
Okay. Yeah, I echo Dave's concerns. The table, especially the numeric table, suggests that we have more precision than we really do, especially two of the three columns are fairly arbitrary. And so we're making things that are pretty similar look not very similar. And that's the concern I have, is be taken out of context. But anyway, so I would echo my concern about that. I'm not sure how to fix that. I guess maybe Nadia's suggestion that that's our job in the final report to explain that.
Right. Well, I would say the vibration and the construction noise vibration columns, I term these as being a quantitative analysis for the operational noise and qualitative for the other two. I mean, we really just don't have enough information. I don't have equipment rosters or construction phasing or
exactly.
anything like that. So we kind of had to leave it at a qualitative assessment. But I think
at that stage
real,
of engineering,
so,
you're kind of making educated guesses, and it makes it. But when the public sees this, they think, oh, they've done a rigorous analysis and they've got this down. And I think this is more just a rough guidance and not a final precise number. Okay, you mentioned the horn. I agree. I live near the tracks, and some of the people blast the horn, and some engineers have, especially at night, give a toot toot, and you can hardly hear it. Did you measure horn, and can you, if you break the noise up into three pieces, the horn, the engine, and the wheels, do you have a rough dB level for each of those?
The prediction method that we use does calculate those separately. And of course, we, for the existing condition, we had horns in there, and for the future ones, they did not include horns. So those certainly were taken into consideration. Also in these predictions, we included, and in the report, one of the appendices to the report actually has the calculation sheets in there that show the different contributions from the different sources, different train sources and the highway sources.
All the numbers I saw were like average noise over a certain period of time. There was no instantaneous. Like if the horn lasts for 10 seconds, but then you average that content over a minute, that really dilutes that sharp horn. So I was curious.
You're right. Well, you're right. One of the metrics that we use sometimes is the maximum level. And if we go back to the figure that showed, here we go. Here, the gray line is L max. So that is the maximum horn level over the entire event. So the typical event for these passenger pass-bys is usually on the order of 10 to 20 seconds from when you first hear the horn to where the train has passed you, right? Okay. And there can be a big difference between that maximum level and the associated average over that like 5-minute interval. Now none of that energy is left out. It's just spread out over a longer period. And the metrics that we're reporting here are the peak hour and the 24-hour LEQ. Mm-hmm. But the important thing that if you reported only the max level and you wanted to, I mean, the max level for these events often lasts for a fraction of a second, literally a fraction of a second. And when they have done kind of dose response relationships in tests where they subject people to, well, they ask people their response to in different environments. They ask people who live near an airport where they know the noise level is a certain amount, and they ask people who live near a highway where they know the noise level is a certain amount, and they ask people who live in a very rural environment, and they ask them how annoyed they are by the noise. The metric that tends to best predict their annoyance as a function of the actual noise level is that LDN level. So if you want to predict how annoyed someone's going to be by noise, the best metric to use is that LDN, because that it takes into account the weighting for being more sensitive at night, and it considers noise, because if you just say maximum noise level, then you have to say how many times do you experience that maximum noise level. Obviously, if you look at this chart here, there is somewhere, we actually did a kind of an analysis to figure out approximately how many train events. We came up with 88, and that's within a few. I think the actual number is 92. So some of these, and maybe some of the ones that are a little bit louder, is where you maybe had a simultaneous train crossing. So maximum noise level, while that's important to keep in mind, that's usually not the best predictor of annoyance. because a maximum noise level, it could happen once a day, it could happen 100 times a day. But when you take into consideration,
LEQ is averaged over an hour, is it? 1 hour averaged?
Well, LEQ means that's the noise, that's the energy average of the noise over some specific period of time. So the metric that we used in terms of our prediction, let me see if I can get back. Okay, in this table here, this is the results of our prediction for the operational noise. We took into consideration both of those metrics. So this would be the average noise level over the loudest hour of the day, which we assume to be about 10 train pass-bys an hour. And also the traffic near the peak noise for the traffic at that time. And the LDN is that 24-hour average with the 10 dB penalty added at night. And it's actually pretty unusual that they're usually this close. I mean, that's almost just a fluke. You don't expect them to usually be that close. But we looked at both those metrics, so you could evaluate it either during the worst hour of the day or the 24-hour average with that nighttime penalty. Odd that they're that close, but that's what they are. You know, but the problem with an LMAX is it doesn't take into account how many times that happens. And an environment that has 100 dB LMAX that happens once a day versus an environment that has a LMAX of 70 dB that happens 200 times a day, you know, the former is going to win every time in terms of annoyance.
So if just the horn went away and the train stayed as is, how much would these numbers go down?
Well, you can see up here in these first, I list them at all, they're not really alternatives, but you say existing with horns diesel. That's essentially what you're looking at now, or at least as far as our prediction went. So you're saying for these first row homes on the west, which are getting the most noise because they're closest to the trains, you're talking about in the low to mid 80s. And then even the loudest of these alternatives would be what, the 69.4 for the closure and underpass. You know, that's still a 14 decibel reduction. That's massive. Okay. So you're right, and I'm not sure if it was Dave that brought this up originally, but you know, we're kind of fighting over onesie, twosie dBs here, but the reduction from the existing is like 15 dB. So it's, I mean, for the worst, well, the less good alternative, you're still talking about a pretty massive improvement over what the existing level is. So we're talking about, you're getting 90% of your benefit by getting rid of those horns. And then the other 10% is kind of, you know, duking it out for those, squeezing out that next 1 or 2 dB really.
So when we look at these noise levels, what's the spectral content? What frequency range do we talk about? Is it mostly like 1 or 200, or do we just go up into the thousands of hertz?
Well, train events tend to have a, I'm glad you asked about it. I didn't say anything about frequency. All of these levels that are A-weighted, all these ones we're talking about here, this is all composite for across, they're A-weighted across the entire spectrum, right? So train events tend to have a pretty complex spectrum. The engine noise tends to be low frequency, rumbly noise, as a locomotive goes by. The horn noise is actually constructed intentionally to be a very disconsonant combination of usually 6 to 8 different frequencies that are made to sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. So they have a lot of tonal content. And the wheel rail noise tends to be a higher kind of, you think with the wheel rails going by, they tend to be kind of this almost squeaky metallic noise. So it's really all over the place, depending on which of the sources you're talking about. And you add them all together, it's a pretty wide-ranging cacophony of different noise from the frequency spectrum standpoint.
And so when you talk about noise versus vibration, are you breaking it down and saying anything below 200 hertz is considered vibration and everything above it is noise? Or
no, noise and vibration are really two separate things. Noise is the air vibrating, and it's picked up by your ears and interpreted by your brain into sound. But it is a special type of vibration. It's the vibration of the air molecules in the air. When we talk about vibration, ground-borne vibration, we're talking about a vibration force that's imparted by the train into the ground, and it's actually the ground moving, and it's measured in actual velocity units, inches per second. So, so they're related in the fact that they're both a special form of vibration, but they don't really correlate into, what's the vibration level, can I convert this vibration level into a sound level, unless you're talking about something completely different than what we're talking about here. So.
Okay, and the last thing is, one thing I didn't see in the report, what I expected to hear, I see something about the viaduct resonance. It's a structure and you hit it with this broadband noise, and that broadband noise is going to include its natural frequencies, so it will resonate. But didn't talk about the resonance at all of the viaduct.
You see that much more on steel structures, and mostly older structures on viaducts and bridges. As the train goes by, you actually hit these resonant vibrations in the spans and the components of a bridge, which will, if you think about, if you walk up to a bridge that's made out of these metal components and you hit one with a sledgehammer, what's it going to do? It's going to ring, right? It's going to go bang. And it vibrates like that when a train goes over. So the bridge itself, or a viaduct itself, can create its own noise. But what happens when you take these modern structures are usually structural steel encased in concrete. And what happens when you hit a concrete column with a sledgehammer? It goes boom. It doesn't ring. You don't get that same, when you talk about resonance vibration in a supporting structure like a bridge or a viaduct, that's usually almost always responding to a steel, a bare, untreated steel structure. And you can,
but still,
I think you
there
can
still
kind
will
of
be
visualize
local
that, right?
resonances. Like the rails are mounted, and rails are going to have some resonant frequency, and even concrete is not a high damping object. So you would expect to see some resonance even in concrete portions.
Not in an audible range, though.
What's the natural frequency that you would see in it?
In terms of, well, that the frequency is completely dependent upon the size and the shape of the structural components. Long, skinny piece of metal is going to vibrate more than a short, stout piece of metal. So you're talking about structural dynamics now, and but I would say for
these things are huge. They should have some natural frequency within the audible range.
They're very heavily damped compared to a bare structural steel.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Hello.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I had muted myself accidentally. I was saying it's now Phil Burton's turn, followed by Adina. And then if you're a member of the public who wants to speak on this issue, if you could put your hands up, that would be helpful at this time. So Phil, I'll give it to you, and then Adina. And let's just be mindful of the time. So keep your questions as on point as we can.
I'd like to make 4 points. The first regards to the table, the complete table where we show the complete figure of merit, let's call it, but back that one, the overall rating table.
Yeah.
So I've seen those terms of figure of merit, for example, and I've got a real concern about mixing the construction score or rating with the noise and vibration, because noise and vibration are forever. Once we put the railroad in place, that's how it's going to sound. Construction is a temporary number. And by the way, it's also very subjective. And I'm afraid that we could influence the scores, and given all the issues that they brought up about the scores, by combining them into a single overall rating. I would much prefer to have construction as a separate score on its own. Because construction impact is not just the noise, it's also the duration, the dust, as well as obviously the costs. That's point 1. Point 2, I'm concerned about the comment that I saw in the report about airplane noise not being significant. Now, this may be dependent on exactly where you live in Palo Alto, but I know that I'm under the flight paths, the SFO, and the damn planes, at least before COVID, were very loud and very frequent, not insignificant. Any comment, reaction to that point?
Yeah, well, I agree about the construction noise part, because construction noise is temporary, but I think it's a mistake to just pretend like it's not a component. And I would agree, maybe one of the answers is, I was trying in this table here to provide kind of a composite of, let's consider these 3 things together. And maybe they shouldn't be considered together. But and it's true that while we took a more quantitative approach on the operational noise. The other two were more qualitative, and maybe you'd leave those separated. But I wouldn't say construction noise is not. The example I always use is the Big Dig in Boston, where they took a major interstate that was above ground and then they put it under downtown Boston. It's a construction, it's temporary, right? It took them 12 years to do that. And the people who lived in that part of town were completely besides themselves.
It took way longer than it was supposed to, by the way. I know it was a real scandal of the situation.
But still here, and I think some of the things that influenced the rating for construction had to do with the duration. You're talking about some of these for the viaduct and the grade crossing closure were on a 2-year duration. And the tunnel and the trench, they're talking about 6 years. And the ones like the tunnel and the trench and the hybrid, they had the added impact of having truck routes that are for months and months and months, heavy trucks going through these neighborhoods, either taking dirt out or bringing dirt in. So if you wanted to leave it here and leave it on its own, I can completely understand that. I was trying to put together something that kind of tried to wrap things up, but maybe you're right. Maybe wrapping everything up in one simple table is oversimplifying.
Yeah, again, if I were to buy a house or consider buying a house near the right of way after the construction, I wouldn't care about the construction impact. That's all done.
Yeah.
And I'm not minimizing it. Believe me, I'm not minimizing that. I just think it confuses the issue rather than helps the issue to lump the construction noise impact with the operational noise impacts, which are perpetual.
Well, I can see that point of view, and I would be, if you thought that, I wanted to put as much helpful information in there as I thought I could. If you thought as a committee that is oversimplified, you think people are going to just flip the report, go to that last page, here's the answer. I don't need to concern myself with all this other hubdrub. Maybe we take it out, and if that would be a valid concern. I wouldn't want to take the construction noise table out, the one we're looking at here, or more accurately, the one that's in the report, because it actually includes some details about our assumptions of what type of equipment would be used and whether it would be haul routes and pile drivers and that sort of thing. But I wouldn't want to take it out, but I would be open to the idea of removing that final table if you thought that it was oversimplified.
Yeah, again, I agree that information has to be present. I just think it's misleading to lump that in with the overall figure of merit.
All right. Sorry. Did you have one other point that I missed?
Well, I have two other points actually, but about the airplane noise. I'm going to contend that it's far more of an impact than you seem to suggest in your report.
What I was suggesting is the metrics that we're using, the peak hour and the LDN, they would be the same whether we included or excluded the airplane noise, because the airplane noise was relatively infrequent compared with traffic noise. So that is, if I calculated the loudest hour LEQ for like 4 to 5 o'clock in the afternoon, there's going to be 10 trains, there's going to be 1,800 cars, and there's going to be 2 airplanes. And the 2 airplanes, even though they're noticeable, they're not going to actually move that needle much.
Actually, I think with SFO, I think they can handle 30 planes an hour on each of 2 runways. And they do get backed up. So as a side note, I would question your assumptions about plane frequencies. The 2 other points I want to bring up have to do with train noise and nighttime versus daytime operation. So with train noise, did you at all consider the effect of a train approaching a station and the squeal of the brakes? Because that's a particularly high-pitched noise.
That can be. The way that train operators usually like to work is that they don't have to apply the brakes a lot when they're coming into the station. They like to kind of coast into the station. And when they do that, it mitigates that squeal noise. Also, I would say that and I'm not sure if this is a shortcoming, but our assumptions were really focusing on the noise near the grade crossings, because that's where the noise problem is. So we did not take into consideration brake noise coming into the station.
Well, as train speeds increase, brake noise will also increase.
Well, on these EMU units, they usually have regenerative braking. Regenerative braking doesn't mean you don't have pads on a disc or pads on a drum. You engage a generator, which sucks the energy back out of the brakes as you reduce speed.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the regenerative braking, but you still need pads on a disc for the final part of the stop. Okay, the last point relates to nighttime noise. Now, I live about a half mile from the Caltrain right-of-way, not far from the Meadow Crossing, and I can't really hear trains in the day, but at nighttime, I can clearly hear the freight trains, both the engine, both the horns, and the wheel rail noise. And so it would have been useful if you had shown the long-term, the 24-hour noise studies showing the differences between daytime passenger operation and nighttime freight operation, because otherwise I think you're sort of simplifying things because there are only 3 freights at night, but this is at night when people want to sleep. So I think that's kind of hiding useful information.
Well, the biggest, the difference in the contribution of the nighttime noise. Now you're right, you might notice the noise more at night, but the biggest reason for that, if you look at this 24-hour, you see the ambient noise drops way down. It drops down from being in the mid 50s to 60 down to about 40 at night. So the background noise drops off. So you're more likely to hear the noise from the trains that come by in the middle of the night.
But then we're in agreement that we are in agreement that if we are more likely to hear nighttime noise, we ought to make that explicit.
Well, the fact is there's so fewer. I mean, there's only we were told on average there's about 3 freight trains a night, and each of those events only happens for about a minute. So we took that into consideration. They're part of the calculation.
Yeah,
but
I have to question that 1 minute because freight trains are a lot longer than passenger trains, and they run at slower speeds. And I know when I hear the trains at night, it is certainly more than 1 minute.
Right.
And I live far enough away that it's not going to keep me up at night, but if I'm still up, I can hear it.
Right. Well, and again, they may not be much louder at night, but during the day, the noise from the train is masked by traffic noise and other community noise. And at night, most of that disappears. So what you're left is you can hear things from further away that you weren't able to hear. Also, the one thing you might get at night, often at night, you'll have something called a temperature inversion, which means that normally during the daytime, the temperature goes down as you increase in elevation. But sometimes when you have radiant cooling at night, that actually switches, it causes sound waves to bend back down. And so if you're, say, a half a mile away, you may not hear that noise normally because the noise just radiates straight up. But at night, sometimes the sound waves actually curve back down. And sometimes they have more of a direct path to your house, which makes them be a little bit louder, a little bit more noticeable. But
so that raises the question of, did you measure during a temperature inversion effect, or did not take that into account?
We did not. And the temperature inversion doesn't happen every night. You need special circumstances for that to work. So sometimes it's there and sometimes it's not. But really, it's the noise is more noticeable. Generally, I would say you notice the trains at night because the ambient level is lower and the train noise is not as easily masked, especially that lower level wheel rail noise and that sort of thing.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you.
All right. Thank you. Good questions.
Okay, we've hit 6 o'clock, which is technically when we're supposed to end, but it is not unlike us to go long. So I'm going to give it over. So it looks like, I think Greg, you already asked a question. So I'm going to let Adina ask her question now. And then Greg, you can go. And then I actually have a question before we go to public comment. I see we've got 3 attendees who have their hands up for public comment. If there's anybody else, please put your hand up now. That'd be great. Okay, so Adina and then Greg.
Okay, yeah, so on the topic of the aggregate versus disaggregate, my opinion is that having some aggregate information is really useful for the many people who are not going to dive into the weeds, but breaking out the information between, I agree with the recommendation to break out the construction versus the into the future. So summarize, but summarize without the construction. And in terms of the summary, I think in doing that summarization, it's really, really, really important to make the visualization be clear about what the difference is between the future condition and the current condition, because this is really counterintuitive to people. When I talk to people in the community, people like really express a lot of distress about the potential difference between option A versus B versus C. And it turns out that the difference between the current condition and the future condition is so much better that that's the biggest difference. And people do not understand that. So having a visualization that makes that really clear is very important to do. And then also something that's going to be counterintuitive to people is the underpass is actually noisier because of the car noise. That is not something because people are more used to cars than trains, and they're like, oh wow, something that makes the train more prominent is going to be worse than the thing that seems to have the change with the cars, but that's actually not true. So having the summary and then making clear the difference between the current and future conditions, I think is going to be really important for people to be able to understand that.
Well, do you think it would be helpful? Let me only ask you, if we took this predicted operational noise table and maybe instead of this, or maybe in addition to this, instead of expressing these noise levels as 69.4 and 68.4 and 67.1, express them as the reduction from existing?
Yes, I think
so
that.
Say, well, this one's going to give us a 10 dB reduction. This one's going to give us an 11 dB reduction. This one's going to give us a 12 dB reduction.
I think that might be helpful. I would want to see it to confirm that it psychologically did the right thing, but I suspect that that would be very helpful for people because that's not how people think intuitively based on what they say. And then last, a trivia point to something that Greg brought up in terms of the schedule and the versions of the baby bullet that don't stop in Palo Alto. One of the things that Caltrain has consistently said that they want to take advantage of with the electrification and the fact that the electric trains accelerate more quickly is being able to hit more stops in the same amount of time, and also being able to run a more even schedule to be able to do better connections with other transit. And therefore, I wouldn't put tons of attention into modeling the current gap 2 schedule that has several different express patterns, because based on what Caltrain is planning, I doubt that would be a future condition. And so I think that is a nuance is probably not worth going into.
Well, if we wanted to use a different assumption for what the total number of trains were, say you're currently going by the current schedule, which is like 92 trains a day, we think that 150 trains a day would be more appropriate. I think we could do that. It may be a little confusing if you decide you want to have 4 sets of numbers in there. Say, well, here's the current, here's what we're going to have in 2025 with this bond measure. We're going to have in 2030 with the high-speed train. I mean, you start the more variations you put in there, I think, and I'm not trying to oppose your idea here. I'm just saying the more alternatives you offer in terms of not just the design alternatives, but the future traffic alternatives, that only makes it, it's going to tend to make it more confusing. And like I said, I think
I was actually recommending fewer alternatives than Gregory was describing, because he was mentioning a nuance of the current schedule that is not captured. But based on the information that Caltrain has put out, I would not expect that nuance to be preserved in the future.
Yeah. Let me jump
in.
I
So let me finish and then I'll be done. So if we want to, do a finer grained simulation of where Caltrain is going, they have published in a bunch of detail their prototypical future schedules. So the information is available to use if we want to go there. But if we do not want to go there, then we are, I think, not going to need the nuance that Gregory mentioned. And that is what I have to say.
But I'd like to jump in very quickly based on what Adina said. When we need to when people question the whole rationale for the grade crossings, and they'll say, well, so what if it's a few minutes more traffic? Well, it may be a lot more noise with increased frequencies if we don't do these separations. Okay, that's what I needed to say. Thank you.
Well, it's important to understand, are you trying to illustrate the different, how the relative benefits of these different alternatives would change with increased traffic volume in terms of trains? Or are you trying to illustrate how much noise levels will go up as a function of the increase in the traffic? So, I mean, our goal here was to be able to provide a relative comparison of these different alternatives. Which of these would be the best thing to build? Not necessarily whether you should tolerate Caltrain, increasing their schedule by 1.5.
So let me make a clarifying point here, because what we're seeing here is that the future condition compared to the present condition is like -15. And if you then say, okay, Caltrain is going to increase its frequency by 20% or by 50%, whatever, will that make that future condition be worse, or will it be better, but better by smaller amount?
Well, almost certainly, you'd have to increase the number of train volumes by an order of magnitude in order to erase that benefit you're getting from eliminating the horn soundings. I mean, you'd have to increase the amount of traffic by a factor of 5 to 10 in order to approach getting back to the same levels without horns.
Right, which is in no way envisioned. Right. Which is not envisioned.
Right.
So
I don't think you're.
Yeah.
But that's a little bit of a different objective. Do you want us to evaluate the effect of increasing the train volumes, or because I think our direction on this was to evaluate the relative benefits of these different design alternatives. So there'd be a little bit of a difference in what we were set out to do, and we could do that if you want. I mean, I think we would. Then you're looking at almost a three-dimensional matrix, though, because you're saying, oh, here's the different alternatives for these different receiver locations. Here's the different answers for all these different design alternatives. And now here's yet another axis comparing the differences between different train volumes. So every time you throw in a new parameter, it multiplies the complexity of it. We can certainly do it.
Right. I suspect that is overkill, as long as we communicate the main point that you made, which is that you would need like 10 times as many trains to make it worse than it is now, because people are going to be skeptical and they're going to think, hey, someone is trying to put something over on me, and by increasing the train volume by 20%, it's going to get a ton worse. So that fact needs to be communicated so people level of anxiety can reduce, that is not going to make the biggest impact.
Okay, yeah. Well, let me just make a request. Nobody quote me as saying they need to increase the trains by 10, a factor of 10. I mean, it might be close to that, but let me figure that out before we put it in writing. But I think I could address that. Say you'd have to increase the trains by a lot in order to overcome the benefit of eliminating the horns.
Okay, this is Nadia. If I could just interject, I think the XCAP is trying to choose between alternatives. There's a different argument between explaining that more trains are coming and that not having grade steps, the difference between how it is now and then when more trains are coming is a different problem that relates to what the city's doing. But XCAP's focus is really just using this noise study to help us choose between the existing alternatives. So it would be up to the city manager and others to kind of do that other piece, because yes, the amount of bells and whistles that happen every time there's more events matters, but it doesn't change how XCAP is choosing between the alternatives, if that makes sense.
I would agree with that. Makes a lot of sense.
Okay. Adina, you went. Phil and Greg, can you make it super fast? Because we really have to get to public comment and we've got another item on the agenda.
So I'll just go super fast. I think we have temperature inversion here, because from my house near the highway, I can hear the trains 2.5 miles away at night. I can hear the horn, and I can hear Shoreline Amphitheater, which is about 3 miles away. So we should put in our report at some point, there's going to be a lot less train noise because there aren't going to be horns, and you can hear the horns all over town. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Phil, you had a final thing, or can you put your hand down?
I'm done. I made my points twice already. Thank you.
You can put your hands down. Okay, before we go to public comment, I did have, I think I have 3 questions. So one is, Paul, you didn't discuss how a noise barrier when the train stays on grade could impact noise. And I was wondering, like, for example, in the closure, if you put a 6-foot parapet around the closure at existing conditions, what does that do to the noise? And could you talk about it? Are there different types of noise barriers, or is there one type? Is there a translucent type? Like, what's our menu of alternatives here?
Okay, well, that's a great question. As I was doing this analysis, I kept thinking, nobody asked about just putting a 6-foot barrier up where you have the current at grade condition, but that would help. And depending on the, frankly, it wouldn't do much help until you get rid of the horn sounding, because you're talking about what is it? They say choking on gnats and swallowing camels, right? So you got to get rid of that worst offender before anything else even makes any sense. But once that's done, putting that parapet barrier and just putting it on grade against the existing, if you were to say do a closure, that could have a pretty good and it's like the least expensive option there would be, right? Just put up a noise barrier, and it wouldn't have to be tall because it just has to be tall enough to block that wheel rail noise and maybe that lower power unit noise for the EMU trains.
So, but what would that mean, for example, on the underpass options?
Well, that would help. Yeah, because one of the problems with the noise reduction for the underpass option is that it's really not doing anything to reduce the noise from the train operating at grade. If you introduced a parapet barrier in addition to the underpass, that would probably reduce train noise by about a good 5 dB.
And is there a difference between the height of the parapet? In other words, is a 3-foot parapet different than a 6-foot parapet? And what's usually, if I know this was done with assuming that there was a locomotive, but if they're EMUs and all of the noise is coming from down low, then could we get away with the 3-foot? What would the difference be? And I would say emphatically, yes, we would want to include this in a final report because this is kind of one of the main discerning factors for us.
Yeah, well, a 6 foot is a good height. I mean, you do, if you, normally we would recommend that those parapet barriers, those partial height barriers would have acoustical absorption on the inside. So the noise doesn't just bounce off the barrier, bounce back off the train body and then back over the barrier. So you want to make those acoustically absorptive, but that's not rocket science. That's easy to specify that in your design. You might be able to trim a foot off of that and still have it be effective. But you don't need much more than that because you don't have to worry about multiple reflections if you have that acoustical material. So I would say when you different types of barriers, some are reflective, some are absorptive. You'd want one that was absorptive on the train side. But I don't think you'd want to go much below 6 feet, and you probably don't need to go much above 6 feet if indeed on those EMUs, the power units are down near the wheels.
Okay. And then this is like asking about unicorns. Is there such a thing as a transparent 6-foot parapet?
I'm sorry, is a transparent barrier?
Is there a transparent parapet? In other words, you do have these see-through, and like when I was in Europe in near Amsterdam, they've got these kind of see-through noise barriers for cars. And I'm just wondering what do they exist?
We have some of those on highways in California. There's people who live along I-5. They have a beautiful ocean view. Caltrans says, hey, we're going to put a barrier in to reduce the noise. And they go, the hell you are. I can't see the ocean. So yeah, there are a number of different transparent type barriers. They have some drawbacks. There's a lot of instances with birds flying into them. And sometimes some of the less expensive ones tend to yellow over time. You usually cannot make a transparent barrier acoustically absorptive is the problem. So something that makes it absorptive requires some porosity, and transparent barriers and porosity usually do not go together. You could do a solid barrier like on maybe 4 feet and then extend by another 3 or 4 feet with a transparent barrier, but a fully transparent barrier would defeat one of the design objectives of having it to be acoustically absorptive.
Okay. And is there any specific, so I also wanted to point out that there is a Caltrain EIR that was done for electrification, which probably has a lot of the noise and braking stuff that you would need. So I would just want to offer that as a reference for you. Was wondering if there are any measures that could help lower the noise of freight, specifically over Caltrain trains, because they are different.
Well, freight does have a different character in that it is mostly wheel rail noise. I mean, they do have locomotives, and I think our assumption was 50 trains and 2 locomotives. Freight trains usually have multiple locomotives, so there is more so there is some more locomotive noise, but there is much more wheel rail noise because sometimes these things go on. I said 50. Sometimes they can be up to 200 trains, 200 cars in some of those trains. But generally, the same things that are going to work for the passenger trains are going to work for freights. It's just, like I said, it's the being able to reduce that wheel rail noise has a bigger benefit for a freight.
Okay, great. And the last question I have is, how much further away will the elevated trains be heard? So you talk about it going beyond the second row of houses, but how much further does that sound?
Well, in our original analysis, that went all the way up to the last 2 pages of the presentation, we were assuming that you would get less noise abatement at the second row because you are raising up where you'd be losing some of that first row reduction. So that first row of homes, there's gaps in between the homes, but generally it works as a noise barrier. Mm-hmm. And a noise barrier only works if it actually blocks the line of sight between the source and the receiver. So if the typical house is 15 feet high, and now the train is on a platform that's 20 feet high, and the locomotive is 15 feet high, that means that exhaust is now 35 feet in the air, and it's going to go over that first row of homes, and it'll go unabated into the second row of homes. With these EMU units, that might be a much reduced, because not only is the elevation of the power source going to be less high, but it's also going to be behind a barrier. So yeah, it may have a much less of a negative impact of having that of the second row shielding.
Okay, so when we're done with public comment, ex-cappers, we will come back and take action. And so some of the things that we could take action on would be requesting any specific additional information that we think we need. And so I would just ask you to, while we're listening to public comment, also be noodling what are the things that you think we actually need to be able to make an informed decision going forward. So with that, I'll stop asking questions. And I see that we have 3 attendees. So you can each have 2 minutes because you've been super patient. And Ruchika, I'll let you take it over.
Thank you. Our first speaker is Rachel Croft. I'm going to wait for a few seconds so Nate can put up the timer, and then you can begin to talk. Nate, are you able to share your screen?
Okay, there, I just unmuted.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. We're just waiting
Excellent.
for, we can have the timer on. It just, yeah, yes, you can begin to talk now, Rachel.
Okay, great. Thank you. This is a fascinating study. I live on Mariposa near Churchill, so I am actually back the first row west of the track. So super relevant to me, all of the findings here. I agree with many of the ex-caps comments on the final table. When I saw that, I thought it doesn't really seem fair I feel like the ex-cap and the community should decide what's important and what should go into a final rankings table. Meaning that I think, for me personally, noise is much more important than vibration, and also final configuration is much more important than construction. So I'd love to have that rating or ranking table agreed by ex-cap before it's included. And then I also wanted to just say, for example, on vibration, where really the harms or the benefits of vibration are primarily for my row of houses, I see the viaduct as being positive in this report, but just wanted to tell the ex-cap that in my personal opinion, where I'm the only one who would benefit from that vibration reduction, I would also be hurt by this massive viaduct in my backyard, like right on my property line. I would much rather have the vibration of the train at the level than have the viaduct up there. So just to let you know, as I'm the one that has the stakes on the vibration issue. I also think you guys brought this up, but doing nothing should not be an option. At every ex-cap, there are people that get up and say, why don't we just do nothing? And as the trains increase from 92 to 150 trains, that horn, which is the most important, and I was glad to see it was the most important because it does seem the most impactful for me, that's just going to get more and more frequent and become more and more of the nails on the chalkboard all day long. And then lastly, I haven't been at the last 1 or 2 ex-caps, and I'm really hoping the underpass. I heard the issues with Caltrain not wanting to give up the right to four tracks and not having any flexibility on space constraints. So I wondered if there was a possibility to relook at the number of lanes on Alma and just reduce the scope of that project so that Caltrain's right-of-way is not an issue. Because I know.
Time.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Can I ask real quickly? You are first row west. Do you feel the trains when they come by? Do you feel the vibration?
I don't really notice them. The freight train, yes. When I'm on the second floor of my house, but honestly, we slept in the backyard last week when it was hot, and I didn't feel it as much when I'm lying on the ground as when I'm in the second floor
Yeah,
of my
usually you don't feel it outside. It's inside because the structure vibrates. But okay, well, thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
And by the way, Paul, typically in our meetings, we don't sort of address the public comment because it's okay, but we have a very engaged public and we could keep you here all night. So that's just a warning there. So, okay, Stephen Carlson, it's your turn.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I just wanted to say thanks to the XCAP for asking for this study and agree it's fascinating. And want to thank Mr. Burge for an excellent analysis as well as really clear presentation. In terms of communicating to the public, there's been a lot of talk about the numbers and the tables, and I think it's actually probably most effective to stay away from any of that. This is really a very, very important study because it dispels a couple of common myths that are out there. And I think that addressing those in terms of talking points is probably the best way to communicate this. So number one is that all of the options on the table are going to result in a significant noise reduction in regards to the current state. And I think that we all understand that and have understood that, but I think the general public really doesn't yet. And so that's important. The second major point pertains to the viaduct, because there's a very common perception that elevating the viaduct would create more noise for everybody all across Palo Alto. And so it's really, really surprising here to find out that in fact, the opposite is true. And so I think that's an important talking point, is that the viaduct not only is not noisier, but it's actually the one that is rated by the consultant overall to have the lowest amount of noise. And I think we could debate, is it a small amount, moderate amount? But I think however you say it, it is not associated with more noise. And I think it's important for people to understand that. I think also to understand why, and the specific reasons that it is, without getting into the numbers.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Lindsay Joy. Feel free to unmute and you can talk now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so first I want to express my appreciation to the XCAP group for your dedication, tireless dedication to this very important issue. I live in a 2-story home on Park Boulevard, about 50 feet west of the rail right away. And I wanted to get clarification on the noise and vibration study, whether it was evaluated at different elevations, because we definitely noticed the freight trains. They shake our second story quite dramatically compared to our first floor. And I'm especially interested in knowing how the viaduct would impact our home in regards to both noise and vibration. And ideally, if you could separate the data for first floor or second floor, and I'd be happy to have the consultant come to our house and do measurements if that is helpful. So anyway, that's my question and comment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our final speaker is Susan Newman. Feel free to unmute and you can talk.
Hi, I don't know how I managed to be last every time, but it wasn't planned. I just wanted to say how much I appreciate this study. I think I agree with Steve that it was well done. It was well presented. The assumptions were well explained, and the study itself, plus all the thoughtful questions from the XCAP, would really help me as someone who's trying to keep some of my neighbors informed to talk about what was found. And I'll be very careful not to overplay whatever advantages are seen for one alternative versus another. I did want to ask a question, if I haven't forgotten it. Well, maybe I have. Maybe it'll come up to me later. I'll bring it up again. But anyway, I just want to say thanks.
Okay, thank you, Susan. That's our last speaker. So I'll bring it back to XCAP. XCAP members, is there anybody else who did not get a chance to speak before, who has a final question before we move to take any action and then move to the next item?
Okay, this is Inyang.
Yeah.
Hi, I don't know how to read and somehow. Anyway, so so, you know, the difference between, for example, at Churchill, the difference between three options is like, you know, 1 decibel or 2 decibel. And then we did say those are insignificant. So for me, all of these three, you know, comparing these three is insignificant for me because of the difference. Is that fair to say that? Any comments?
Well, to say that they are, the fact that some of these alternatives have very similar results, it is what it is. I mean, to say that they're close means that they're close. And to say that, you know, is it going to make a gigantic difference if you choose between the one that's predicting 64 dB versus the one that's predicting 65 dB? No. Are you going to be able to tell the difference? They're say, man, we should have gone with that other option. I don't think so. The difference is.
So yeah. Why are we comparing them? Why are we ranking them?
Well, for one thing, we didn't know we didn't know that was true until we actually did the analysis, right? And so that's the results. It's not that doesn't always turn out that way.
But, so, I do want to point out that all of the at-grade alternatives, meaning the 2 underpasses and the closure, are not weighted equal, are not represented the same way as the others, because the others all have sound abatement treatment and those do not. And so the fact that there exists the possibility of, for example, putting up a noise parapet on a closure or on the underpasses, you said could be as much of a 5 decibel difference. And
it could, yeah, but that wasn't, you know, if part of the, you know, revisions, you want us to look at different alternatives or variations of alternatives, including putting up noise barriers, you know, we could do that.
Well, I think the other ones you calculated the hybrid and the viaduct, correct, with the noise parapet included.
That's that was part of the alternative, yes.
Right, but you were not given direction to include that for the underpasses or the at-grade closure, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay.
That was part of the alternative. I mean, if they wanted to see different options within alternatives, we could address those, but you know, that was not part of our direction to
I understand,
making up new alternatives.
Yeah. Okay, so this is my observation. So, you know, there is a significant studies done that, you know, it's going to improve about a 20 decibel that we don't, you know, we do great separation. It's perfect. Now, comparing the alternatives, because that was a task that he's supposed to do, and he did, and the difference is 2 decibel for my side, which is first house west of the ARMA. And it's insignificant. I cannot rank any of these are. But because you put the rank or suggest the rank, people are jumping at it, say, oh, thank you. This is, you know, because I'm advocating for viaduct, because therefore, you know, because you rank viaduct the best, and, you know, this is great, which is like, which doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, it's very important to realize, and I think we've said this a number of times, this is strictly the results of the noise vibration analysis. I can see, especially people, for you, the first row west, in not wanting a viaduct, because there's going to be this in addition to your, you know, 8-foot, and I think your house is one I actually measured in the backyard in, right?
Right.
Yeah, and I could see while I was standing back there saying, you know, if they put a viaduct in here, that's going to completely destroy her view. It's instead of seeing the sky, she's going to see a viaduct with a big 6-foot wall on it, and then 80 times a day, she's going to see a train flashing across that. And, you know, those aren't part of our analysis. We're looking at the noise part. So you always have to take the results of this study as it stands now, or however we might modify it. You need to take that in conjunction with the other considerations, and especially aesthetics. Is it going to destroy your quality of life to have a gigantic viaduct literally right over your backyard fence? You know, maybe if you like seeing trains 80 times a day, maybe you'd like it, but maybe not. And
Yeah.
yeah, so that I can't overemphasize that. This is just the noise vibration standpoint. This should not be anybody's final decision. This is something that needs to be taken into consideration with cost and aesthetics and access and safety and traffic and everything else you're looking at.
Oh, thank you. I just want to make a comment.
Yeah.
Observation.
Anybody else, ex-cappers? Okay, so we are allowed to take action on this. So I have a motion that I'd like to make and to see if I can get support for. So I think we need to have this noise report amended and come back to XCAP. The things that I would like to see is, number one, doing the analysis or seeing if the analysis changes using the correct EMUs and not the electric locomotive that was done, and see how that, since it sounded from what Paul described that the sound could be attenuated more with the parapets. So I want to hear that. Going back and verifying the speed, Caltrain operates at 79 miles an hour, but I believe the electrification EIR says that they could eventually go to 110. And you said about the all boats rising, it may or may not make a difference, but I think if we're going to have a final noise report, it should have, we should know what those numbers are. And the third is, I think we should consider the future train schedule at 16 trains per hour, which I think is the max. So to have today's trains per hour and the future with more. And part of it is because the amount of horn and grade crossing noise that happens, I think is going to be significant. And then the fourth thing would be information to be included in the report regarding a noise parapet, the 6-foot wall for the on-grade alternatives, meaning for the closure and for the 2 underpasses. I also was going to make a suggestion that maybe for that chart that nobody seemed to love, at least being able to call out the fact that the construction column is a temporary noise column versus the other 2, which are permanent noise columns. So maybe that kind of labeling might help. So that is my motion. Do I have a second?
I second that.
Okay, my second is Keith Rechtel for Sarah. I don't know if you're hopefully helping.
Okay, just clarification on that last one, where you suggested removing that kind of composite table?
No, I was suggesting simply making some sort of delineation that shows that the construction column is a temporary noise versus the other 2. And however you want to highlight that. It might, I'm just trying to offer some kind of, there was a lot of consternation about that column, about that table. And I don't know if I don't think we should remove it, but I understand the consternation about the way it's constructed. And if there's a suggestion that you have, Paul, to make it better without taking it out, I'm happy to hear that, to be able to include it in the motion.
Okay.
Any suggestion? Now's your time. Oh, Larry's got his hand up. Maybe Larry has something. Larry, go ahead.
Oh, I think we ought to remove that so-called offending table. I understand why it was there, but I think that each of us can compile his or her own table. You got all of the data there, and you can do your own individual rankings and weightings. So I think it is sort of conclusory, and it's I think it would tend to confuse the public rather than enlighten the public. So I think that the easiest, least costly change would be to just eliminate it. And I am, while I have the floor, I am worried about the cost of the additional information. So I'd like to hear our consultant respond as to how much additional work are we talking about?
Okay, let's see. Well, there's a motion on the floor. There's a second. I've spoken to my motion. I thought, Larry, you were going to offer a
Yes, I moved that we remove the table.
Okay. So it's an alternate motion?
No, it's not an alternate motion. It's an amendment.
Okay, it's an amendment to the motion. I'll take it as a friendly amendment, so I will remove it. Keith, are you okay with that as well?
Yeah, I don't feel strongly either way.
Okay.
I have some concerns that could be taken out of context, so I think it may be a good thing to take it out.
Okay, I see Ed has peeked his head in. Ed, did you have something to say?
Only to follow up on Larry's question regarding additional costs. I don't know that our consultant could respond to the cost question, but maybe just clarification on what's currently within scope versus outside of scope. So either Paul or maybe Millette could respond to that.
I mean, I can.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I mean, my vision of it, well, I'll let Paul respond, and then if I'll chime in some extra, but there's definitely some out of scope items in that list.
There are, I think, we do need to, I mean, our proposed approach was to follow the FTA policy guidance manual, and kind of switching over to getting additional specific data for the EMU required a little bit of extra work. I think I can include you are asking us to, I'm not clear if you want us to look at including that parapet wall as additional alternatives or modifications to existing alternatives. Like, do you want us to look at the underpasses with and without parapet barriers, the 6-foot barriers?
Well, I think you already looked at them without. I think the point is, I mean, and it could be as simple as saying that a noise parapet put at grade gives a 5 decibel reduction. If that's like a standard thing, that helps us sort of also in our heads manipulate, oh, okay, that means that on the closure, it's going to drop by, if we chose to add a noise barrier, understanding that's a cost, it drops the decibel levels. But I did want to make the point that, I mean, I'm curious what else is out of scope. I mean, I have to push back gently on the fact that the EMUs have been selected for a while. They're already in the process of being built. And so I was a little surprised that that was not included. And so I'm surprised that that's out of scope and considered additional work for the city, because I would have thought that that would have been like the baseline, frankly.
Well, part of that reason is that there's no sound information available for this particular car that we're aware of. So we don't know where that could come from so that we could analyze it. We may have to go as far as we'll contact the manufacturer and see if they have that, but there's no published.
I can send it to you. I've got it already from a couple of train friends who sent it. So I think Stadler has it on their website, and I think it may even be in the Caltrain EIR.
It could be. We haven't looked at so you give me a link to that Caltrain EIR. We'll see if it's in there.
Yep.
They may have a reference level in there that we could use.
Mm-hmm. So if we could provide it, do we save some money?
I would need some input when you talk about verifying speeds. I think from what I know and have calculated in terms of trains accelerating and deaccelerating, that 50 miles an hour may not be a bad guess. But if someone wants to, if I have to spend, I'm not a train engineer. I know that sometimes when we do detailed EIRs, we actually are given what they refer to as a speed contour that shows what the train speed will be at different stations. So, but that, part of our modeling was assuming kind of an average speed, over the whole corridor. So, doing a more detailed analysis of exactly what speed it's going at. I understand there's a 79 mile an hour limit, but it takes a mile for the train to get to that speed. So I'm not, I think
what I meant was simply verify that that you said that in the future that speed profile matches what we would need to understand about noise in the future. How's that? And it could be just asking Caltrain. I don't know. I mean,
I'm not really sure either. They may know the answer, and we might need to figure it out. So I don't have the information available. What if I'm going to evaluate it at a different speed? That itself is not that. I could just modify our calculation spreadsheet and change the speed parameter. But knowing what the correct speed is that can be more time consuming.
Okay, I think if you could just say to us, if the speed increased by 20 miles an hour, it would have an increase of this many decibels generally. I think that would be sufficient. It's just a matter of doing that.
Okay, that would be easier to do.
Great.
Nadia, I think we have to vote on Larry's amendment.
Well, but I don't want to make an amendment that's causing us to run up the city's bill. And so let me just put that my
Oh, no. Tony, Nadia accepted the amendment, so that's no. Yeah. And her second did as well, so it's done.
Don't we have to vote on it?
No, you don't. When the maker of the motion and the seconder agree to it, so
so now we'll all still vote on my full motion, Tony, but I've accepted Larry's amendment for the moment, and then we'll vote on the full thing. So what's on the table right now is having them come back with correcting that to be correct the EMUs, including something related to speed. So if speed increases by X number of miles per hour, that might have a change of this many decibels. It's just confirming what that would be. If the including more trains per hour is an issue, then we could drop it. I don't want to, I'll leave that to Ed to decide because it costs more money. And then I think at least adding a line in the report that an at-grade noise barrier of 6 feet could drop the decibels, drop by 5 decibels. If something can be put in the report that says that, that would be sufficient to be able to make sure that people understand that that is an alternative for the closure and for the underpasses. That wasn't necessarily evaluated, but could decrease that further. So that would be the motion.
I got the motion. So do I, Larry, do I not vote for the motion? Because I don't think we should hide these, not hide is the wrong word, keep this information, which are judgment issues from our noise consultant. I'm uncomfortable with keeping that from the public.
Okay,
we should explain it, maybe it's an opinion, but I don't think we should delete it.
Yeah, and I have the same opinion as Tony. So I just don't agree with suppressing the summary view. I think giving people just only all of the detail will be more confusing to some members of the community. So I'm with Tony and won't support suppressing the summary.
Okay, anybody?
I think it might help if the subjective tables were backed up by some sort of methodology. Like if it said, I gave this a 5 because, 65 is more than 62. Or in fact, there's a table earlier in the report that has, green for all the alternatives except red for one of them. That table as well, I'd almost want it, if it's just a footnote or something, I would love to see, I'd love to show the work. I think if we show the work, it's great. If we don't show the work, I think it's gonna be confusing.
Bill, do you have any strong feelings?
So we heard the consultant say that difference of less than 3 dB wouldn't be noticed. Yet the tables are calling out these minute differences in dB, and I would be more comfortable with showing ranges of dB like perceptible, not perceptible, very perceptible, because I think people can relate to that better than they can to the numbers. I think most people will just roll their eyes when they see all these numbers.
Yeah, as the guy who kind of almost started it after Greg, though, I think, I agreed with actually Larry removing it. That's the simplest answer. But if we leave it in there, I think some modifications should be made. I think at a minimum, like what just Greg said, a better legend needs to sit there. Like even the discussion of why the underpass in the Churchill rows is different than the underpass in the Metal Charleston area, but yet the numbers imply that the rankings should be the same, right? That difference should be called out somehow. Another one is, he noted that 0 is no change from now, but when you don't know that information, 0 can be perceived as, oh, this sucks, right? It's the other end of the scale, which we typically see of a 0 to 5. 1 is, really negative, and the 5 is the positive, right? So, and 3 is in the middle, like neutral. Whereas here, really 0 is neutral, and 5 is always, and numbers above that improve from there. And then to Phil's point, the improvements really aren't that much and not even perceivable by humans. So if we want to put a table in there, I think we really need to take a hard look at how we present that information better and improve upon where it is the way it is now. But if we can't do that, and if it's too hard, if it's going to cost us too much money, then I would just opt to say, let's leave it out. Because as you said, Nadia, we have to spend time to translate this anyway to people. So, okay, well, let's do that. So anyway, that's my take on it.
I could propose an alternate solution.
Sure.
I might propose an alternate solution that we appoint a noise subcommittee and that they draft the noise section of our report and that they make, with an actual methodology, it's too bad we don't have Megan anymore, this would be perfect for Megan, our own XCAP subjective table.
Okay, how about, in order to get going and move to the next thing, what about, we remove the the opting of keeping or taking out the table with the feedback to Paul and his team that we don't love it, could you try to fix something? And then when they come back the second time with the report, we review it again and then really make a final decision. And that way it allows for flexibility and hopefully some cost control from the city's part, but also achieves the goal. Larry and Keith, who are Keith my second and Larry the friendly amendment guy, does that work?
Worth a try. I do have to point out that not including the table is hardly an attack on transparency. There's going to be there's nothing there that isn't already in the report, except just the consultant's opinion as to how they should be weighted, and that's just his opinion. Because it's not there's no data that is being removed, no facts are being removed. So I can understand the arguments to want to include it, but not on the grounds of lack of transparency.
If I could add, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to be out of order, but I would agree that there was some personal shading here. I mean, I could have said, well, the noise is very, very important. I'm going to rate that on a scale of 1 to 10, and then vibration on 0 to 3, and that could have changed the outcome. So I tried to do something. I'm not in favor of one alternative over the other, but it may be best that I lay out the analysis for these 3 different components and let the committee decide how they want to combine those, because it really is a subjective. It is a subjective rating.
Okay.
But also in the explanation of the subjective rating, what I heard and what I found really persuasive was some of this is based on a career's worth of experience in, things that make a difference to people's perception of noise and vibration. And I think that the people who are here in this meeting are the kind of people who will look at a table that has like 30 numbers on it and be able to squint and say, okay, I can see what's meaningful. And I think that for a lot of people in the community, that is just going to be like TMI, too much information, and they are not going to retain anything, and they're going to retain the preconceived notions in their head, which, as we have learned from this presentation, people's preconceived notions are wrong. And so I agree with giving direction to try and improve the summary, but I pretty strongly agree with getting rid of the summary as long as we break out the temporary construction impacts from the permanent noise and vibration impacts. They can bring it back and then people can veto it, but I strongly support trying to improve it instead.
Okay, so
my biggest problem with it was the fact that you arbitrarily added the different columns. I didn't so much complain about the data being there, but how you weight that, like Phil was saying, he doesn't care about construction, he just wants the other 2. So having the data there might be the simplest thing and not have to arbitrarily weight it to combine it.
Keith, how about we do this? Why don't we drop this chart from our amendment? So the amendment would stand as just making sure we're using the right EMUs, verify the speed, and looking at the noise parapet or writing the line about the noise parapet and the 5 decibel reduction, and potentially looking at 16 trains an hour if the city staff thinks that that's okay, and leave that as the motion, and then we can make a separate motion regarding the chart. Does that work?
Can I make a friendly amendment? Mm-hmm. I think the most significant thing that that this study shows is that all of the options are better than today's alternative. And if I can suggest a simple table that explains that, I think that's the big story, that all of these alternatives are better than existing.
I thought we had a table that says that already.
Well, we did have a comparison table, but maybe the suggestion was to include not just the absolute level for each one, but show the numbers in terms of the change from existing.
Right. So sorry, it was changing. What's the chart number? It's the one that Adina said that you should do it as you talked about doing it as a difference instead of having it be 60.
Right. This is both slide 25 and it's also from report page 23.
Yeah, okay.
It's a predicted operational noise. So right now I have it in there as absolute numbers. I can include it as both. I could put here is absolute numbers and here's the delta numbers. So
I think, so I will take the friendly amendment, and I think we should include both. Seeing one way and seeing the other, because people's brains work differently, to Adina's point. Keith, are you okay with that?
Yep.
Okay, great. Okay, is there anybody else who would like to speak on the motion that's on the floor?
Before we go to the motion, can we confirm, Paul, that whatever amendments that we are proposing that will be within the scope, like Ed initially was concerned? So we just want to make sure that that can be done so easily and within the scope of cost scope.
You know, I would have to go back and look at the scope. I don't have that memorized, but I think most of this stuff is fairly minor. I know there was a suggestion earlier about producing noise contours. That would be a big change. Most of these are just making some tweaks to how we're presenting the information. If you just want us to, you know, address what would be the difference in general for increasing the number of trains, what would be the difference in general for including barriers, that sort of thing. That's fairly simple to do. It's more complicated to go back and completely regenerate all the results and change every number in every table. So if we can get away with providing kind of some of these general comments, as opposed to having to go back and completely recalculate everything and redo all the results, that would be, I think, much more straightforward to do and take a lot less time.
And to the XCAP, I just want to make sure that that is acceptable solution. So that would be okay. Having a generic statement regarding different items that you're presenting, that how they would overall affect the different alternatives.
Fine. Except for well, the only question is about using the correct EMUs. I don't know how much that changes the actual calculations.
Frankly, I'm not sure either until I kind of need to see the data on the trains. They may be very similar. You know, my gut feeling is that they may not be that different because you need so much power to move a train around, and it you know, probably has more to do with how well shielded the engines are. But I'd like to be able to see if they actually have some data for that. If you said that you thought they did have some data in a report, or so I did look on their website. I looked well, I didn't spend a lot of time on it, but I didn't see anything on their website right offhand in terms of the sort of data that I could use to differentiate that between what our current assumption was.
Yeah, so our assumption would be that that information is readily available, and then we don't have to do something else like make a measurement to figure it out or something like that, that it's readily available for us to assess.
Great. Okay. All right, so I think with that, not seeing anybody else. Tony, you have your hand up. Did you mean to, or is that just by accident? By accident. Okay. Okay, I'm going to take a vote on the amendment or on the motion. I'm missing my roll sheet. So Gregory Braille.
I've kind of lost track of what exactly we're proposing.
Okay.
Maybe someone restate it first?
Yes, I'm restating the motion. The motion is that to have Paul and AECOM come back and give us an updated report that should include verifying whether using the correct EMUs makes a difference in the data, just verifying the speed profile with Caltrain, looking at whether or explaining that a noise parapet at grade could provide a 5 decibel reduction in sound. And that's it. Yes, that's it.
If that's it, then yes.
Okay. Phil Burton.
I'm still concerned about the whole issue of nighttime freight noise, but if there's no other support for that, then I'll.
So why don't we stick to this motion if you have a second motion afterward, but we're voting right now on this.
All right, okay, then I'll vote for this one, yes.
Okay, Tony Carrasco? Yes, okay. I think I need an audible, Tony, because they can't, it's for the video recording or audio recording.
Yes.
Thank you.
Sorry.
In Young Cho?
Sorry, what are we voting for? Sorry, I was distracted.
Okay, motion one more time is that we will be using the correct, that they'll look at the analysis with the correct EMUs, in other words, the correct equipment for Caltrain, that they're going to verify back with Caltrain about speed profile and whether there's a generic number about if you go over this many miles an hour, that the noise increases by this amount. include a one-liner about how a 5 decibel reduction could be achieved with a noise parapet or a sound wall on the at-grade alternatives. And that's it.
Okay, yes.
Okay, Larry Klein.
Yes.
Thank you. Pat Lau is not here. Adina?
Yes.
And Keith?
Yes.
Dave Shen?
Yes.
Carrie Templeton?
Yes.
Great, and I vote yes, so that passes unanimously. Okay, now, does anyone want to take a stab at a motion about the table number 8.1, or are we going to agree to let Paul come back in his next issue and see what he can do as best work? Does someone feel strongly that we need to dictate, or can we just give him some direction there?
You're talking about the summary table?
Yes, I'm asking the XCAP members, yes,
Okay.
if they want to give you very specific direction, or if they want to see what you come back with. Anybody want to give very specific direction, or do we want to see what he comes back with?
I'm happy to see what he comes back with. My preference would be to see the work, and then we can decide whether we want to take it out or make our own.
Great. If you can give me a visual thumbs up, if that sounds okay for you, and then Carrie and Adina, and Keith, I need an audible thumbs up if that works for you.
Thumbs up.
Okay.
Yep.
Thumbs up.
Okay, so we don't need a motion for that. Okay, great. That was a long discussion, but I think long overdue, frankly, for all of us who've been thinking about this. So we really appreciate everybody's time on that one. And thank you to AECOM, and we'll see you back soon. And okay, that it is now 7, so we are way over time. I did want to, since this next item has to go to City Council, I do need to at least get approval for it and make sure you guys are all okay with it. So this is item number 4, is review and approve the chair's XCAP update number 5 to City Council, tentatively scheduled for June 8th. Ed, I was going to ask you, do we have any, can you remind us what time that item is on the agenda? I think it's 5 o'clock, but I just want to be sure. And can you confirm that I will be speaking at the meeting, or is just the report being submitted, or what's happening?
You are on 5 o'clock, all the above.
Cool. All right. Are there any XCAP members who had any issues with the report, or any amendments, concerns, things that we missed, things that you think we needed to add? If you do,
I would move that we approve the report as in our packet.
Okay.
And that's it. I think we have ample opportunity to change or move priorities down the road. And we'll have other meetings with council, I presume, between now and August. So I would let it be the way it is.
Okay, I have to correct you. I'm not sure how many meetings we'll have between now and August, because our report is due August 31st, and the council does go, well, typically the council goes on a break. And I'm not sure, I think Philip and I, when we last looked at the schedule, weren't sure that there would be another council meeting. Of course, if we feel like we really need one, we would have to figure, for some emergency reason, we'd have to figure one out. But otherwise, this is sort of our last thing. Yeah, Ed, I see you.
Early August would be a possibility, but it's that point in time, it's pretty close to when you would presumably be close to done.
Right. Okay. Tony, does that change your answer or change your thinking?
No, it doesn't. It's a good report. It covers our basic where we are and where our thinking at this point.
Okay, Carrie?
I'd like to second that, and I think it's a very detailed report. You did a great job. Thank you very much, Chair Nyack.
Thank you. If I could offer to the group, the one thing that I was going to give it on the number 5, but I did do a presentation to the Palo Alto Bicycle Coalition yesterday, and they actually had a lot of feedback. And so one thing that I thought that I will amend orally at my in my report to City Council is to just reiterate to the council that Payback thought that we're still missing a lot of the bike ped connections. And I wanted to express that that was something that multiple XCAP members have been saying over multiple meetings. And so I wanted to get authorization from you guys that I could amend that to my oral testimony when I give my report to council. So I'm getting thumbs up from the group. I don't know if we have to make that a motion, because it's actually, you're giving me the official okay. So Tony, if you could, that would be a friendly amendment to your motion to move the report as stated, with the addition of me giving an update about the need for bicycle and pedestrian improvements.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for adding that on. I accept.
And
I
Carrie?
accept.
Awesome. Okay, before actually we go to a final vote, I'm going to have you hold because we're supposed to take public comment. We only have 9 people left, but if any of the 9 people still here have anything that they want to say, I do see one person has raised their hands. So Susan, you look like our lone speaker. We'll give you 2 minutes. Hold on one second. There you go. Susan, you can unmute yourself.
How's that?
Good.
Okay. I remembered what I wanted to say the last time, so I'm just going to throw that in really quick. I wanted to say that having alternatives looked at for potential optimizations, not just in terms of sound abatement, but in terms of other modifications to the alternatives, I think is a really good idea, something in general that the XCAP should consider. Your addition of the sound walls was a case in point, but there are others. I want for the sound issue, I wanted to raise the point that there has been talk about doing a modified approach to the viaduct that moves the viaduct closer to Alma and further away from the houses in Southgate, for example. And I wanted to know whether it was worth looking at how that would modify the ratings or the findings. And then
I'm going to stop you. Do you have anything related to my update to City Council? Because that's really what we're taking public comment on.
I don't think I can calculate right now. I just wanted to get that in. Okay.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm just trying to keep you on point because we're way over on this meeting, so I appreciate it. You can always send us your email, send us an email. Okay. So, okay, seeing no other hands up, I'm going to take it back to the group for a final vote. So, Tony, do you want to restate your motion?
I would accept. I move that we accept the memo of what the document that's in our packet that was authored by our chair, and with the addition that our chair added as an amendment, as a friendly amendment.
Okay, about the bike ped issues. Okay, and Carrie, you were a second. So, okay, I'll take a vote. So, Gregory Braille?
Yes.
Phil Burton? I need an audible.
Audible, yes.
Thanks. Tony Carrasco?
Yes.
In Young Cho?
Yes.
Larry Klein?
Yes.
Adina Levin?
Yes.
Keith Reckdahl?
Yes.
Dave Shen?
Yes.
And Carrie Templeton?
Yes.
Great, and I vote yes, so the amendment passes. Okay, great. The last meeting is, do we have any XCAP member updates or any working group updates that anyone feels are pressing at this time? If nobody shakes their head yes, then I think we'll just move this item to the next meeting. And unless staff has any updates, we can adjourn. I just want to close this off.
Nothing from me. Ripon, was there anything that you needed to report to XCAP? We're
okay.
Good.
I did want to mention that, and we can take this offline with staff, but I just wanted to, for Ed and for Ripon, I think it's important that we bring Caltrain back to a future meeting to be able to go over the Caltrain emails before we start deliberations. And so we need to talk about the schedule to make that happen. And I know we're running up against the time for the town hall, but that's another discussion that we'll need to have. But with Philip being out, maybe we can schedule a meeting this week, later this week, to talk about those things. But I just want to make sure that I put that out there. So, okay, awesome. And so with that, our next meeting for right now is set to be June 17th. If for some reason Caltrain can't make it to that meeting, and they might be able to make it next week, we would have to send out a pretty urgent doodle poll to see if people can get together. I don't suspect that that's the way we'll go, because that is a struggle for staff as well. But I just want to make sure XCappers are watching their email just in case.
Nadia, did you want to talk about the time of our meetings going forward?
Oh, yes. Thank you so much for saying that, Larry. Yes. And so earlier start time, we had done a doodle poll for starting the meetings earlier. And I think Pat Lau at some point is probably going to have to drop off, but she was going to try to make those meetings. And I think, Greg, you couldn't start until 3 o'clock, correct? You couldn't do 2:30?
I can do 2:30. It was, I think I tried to make that a maybe, but the doodle poll didn't really have a maybe option. It used to have a maybe option.
Okay.
So no, I mean, I can do any time if everyone else can.
Okay, great. So yeah, if 2:30 works for the whole group, then I think we will try to make the June 17th meeting 2:30. Of course, we will have to have staff check with internally to make sure that that still works for them. And also with AECOM, since our next meeting, it has a lot of AECOM presentations. So we'll have to stay tuned. And Ripon, we can talk about that offline with Ed as well. So thank you for that reminder, Larry. Okay, I think with that, we're adjourned. Thank you so much for your continued patience and engagement, and I hope you all enjoy your dinner.
Well, I like
Thank you, Nadia.
the AE team also, so they did a good job.
And thanks to the behind the scenes staff, which I didn't acknowledge, but there's a lot of them on here making these calls possible and running the clocks and running the timers. So thanks to Nate and to Ruchika and to everybody who's running the controls. We appreciate it. Okay, thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Goodbye.